to quickly rescue people from the cold water, and Hippo at that moment unloaded the rescued onto the deck. The nobles screamed and called for help, while the monster was already walking through the streets of the city. The inhabitants ran away in horror. The hero looked at the knight and ordered him to return immediately. The interlocutor frowned and asked if the lord would really leave the people in trouble. The young man frowned and replied that they had come to earn money, not to fight monsters and maintain peace. He added that this city had its own army and cannons, they would cope even without their help. Xavier stared at the aristocrat in shock and thought that in moments of crisis Lloyd showed resourcefulness and motivated not to give up. He was a man who did not give in to difficulties. The brown-haired man squeezed the oar and said that they themselves were up to their necks and worked to waste time helping the residents of other cities. Now was not the time to play the hero. The knight looked at the master coldly and realized that, in the end, this is who he is. Notice, Xavier's closeness to you has decreased by 5 points. Empathy towards you +1. Relationships with active characters have worsened slightly, but this will not affect RP. RP amount 1901. The knight drew his sword and declared that he would deal with this. The hero flinched and shouted for the swordsman to stay still, otherwise he would die. The interlocutor jumped up and stepped on the sword, using explosive force. He rushed towards the city as if on a surfboard, moving further and further away from the master. The soldiers ordered all combat power to be used. The cannons fired at the monster. Shells rained down on the Titan, but we were not scratched. The soldiers looked at the enemy in fear. Giga growled, intending to kill the people. The monster fired something, destroying the tower. His eyes were burning with the desire to destroy everything. He noticed the fallen part of the statue and rushed towards it. The villagers ran away in fear. One man tripped and fell. The monster's claw was approaching him. Xavier swung and brought down an explosive force on the Titan. His blade touched the enemy, allowing the man to survive. The knight looked forward in shock, not believing that the attack did not work. The guy flew into the building, and the monster roared with renewed vigor. The swordsman took a fighting stance and frowned. The claw was approaching him, but the warrior managed to jump away in time. Giga fired again. His attack was approaching Xavier. He held his sword in front of him, realizing that he could not hold back the enemy. The wave swept him away, and the guy hit the wall. The knight fell to the ground and hurried to get up, leaning on his sword. A monster loomed over him. The blonde pressed his lips together and thought that the monster had taken the bait. That was it. The boy knew that he would never be able to resist such a monster. He could die here, but he would hold on until all the inhabitants were saved. The swordsman looked resolutely at the monster and squeezed the handle of his weapon. The protagonist was floating away on a raft. He was breathing heavily and muttering that he was not the only protagonist in this novel, and it did not matter how many RP he had if they all went to construction. The young man frowned and said that he was also a human, and it hurt him to see how cities were destroyed and people suffered, but he was running away because he could not do anything. Lloyd stopped and fell silent. He looked down sadly and thought about what would happen if he allowed the city to be destroyed and ran away. The boy froze. Finally, he gritted his teeth and, frowning, shouted to Belle that they were coming back. The snake used volcanic eruptions, and the brown-haired man sat on top of it. The young man's face distorted with rage, and he promised that he would make this lobster bastard dance for him yet. Xavier swung with a cry. The monster also went on the attack. The swordsman dodged and gritted his teeth, using an explosive technique. The knight decided that the eyes were a weak spot for any living creature. He jumped up and struck with his blade, but it did not work. The enemy waved his mustache and was about to hit the blonde. The guy froze, looking at the approaching attack. Hippo, one hit. The animal flew up and crashed into the monster. The monster fell, crashing into a building, and the hamster shrank and landed on the protagonist's head. Lloyd armed himself with a shovel and hissed that the enemy should not touch his money. The hero stood on one of the roofs and watched the monster crawling on the ground. Xavier raised his blade above his head, gritting his teeth, and thought that this was the right time to strike. The claw was supposed to cut the swordsman and was heading towards him, but he managed to hit it with the blade and push away. Realizing that he had not dealt any damage, the blonde was at a loss and did not understand why it did not work. Jumping back to the ground, the key figure of the novel pulled the blade behind his back while the monster was running towards him, and thought that it was difficult to find an area for an effective attack and the chances of winning were not so obvious. However, Xavier grabbed the blade tighter and his anxiety somehow disappeared, leaving him perplexed. Looking at his master, who was standing with a menacing look, he thought that the very fact of Lloyd's return increased the chances of winning. 2.5 hours ago, the hero was riding Peepodong at a tremendous speed. They were jumping from one roof to another, trying to get closer to the Titan. The nobleman pressed himself closer to the beast and asked him not to come too close, thereby not allowing them to be discovered. Watching Giga, the protagonist thought that they urgently needed to find his weakness. Xavier again tried to deliver a crushing blow with his blade with a cry. He tried to deliver it to the other limb, but it also had no effect. The hero clenched his teeth and squeezed the phantom's fur, thought that the swordsman's blows did not work at all, and wondered what a monster with such strength was made of. But then the thought began to echo in his head. Lloyd immediately became inspired and knitted his eyebrows, thinking that it was still possible to do this. The guy immediately used the measurement skill and directed it to the side. The Titan's shell lit up from the use of the ability on it. A diagram of the creature with data analysis appeared in the hero's head. The sly one immediately smiled and, thinking over another plan, thought that no matter how living a creature Giga was, it could be measured. The protagonist examined the diagram and realized that his chitin contained ivory a meter thick. Having brought the image closer, he realized that the triple cellular structure overlapped at the molecular level. Having examined it even closer, the nobleman realized that it was intertwined very tightly and formed a kind of bulletproof suit. At this time, Xavier, with fury in his eyes, raised his blade to strike and screamed at the top of his voice. He plunged it into the enemy's shell, thereby creating a large explosion. Lloyd, who was watching the diagram at this time, saw abrupt changes in it and was very surprised. Having turned his gaze to the head, the nobleman noticed an accumulation of energy in one area. At this moment, Giga stuck his horn up and emitted a wave from the tip of the horn. The hero, who was watching this, pressed himself closer to the phantom and thought that he needed to empty the horn to collect all the energy and then release it, and for this he first needed to get rid of this appendage. In the simulation mode, an organ was shown going to it, and the protagonist thought that this place with a water pocket would need to be hit. Then, on the projection, the monster's body was torn to shreds with one lunge. In Lloyd's head, the thought arose that they would be able to cope with it. But then Xavier, who was standing below, looked at his master with alarm and asked what he should do. Then he began to show the horns with gestures with a serious look. And then he waved 2 fingers under the horn. And then the swordsman was extremely perplexed and asked him if Lloyd had gone crazy. And then the already aggressive nobleman began to wave his hands and fingers at high speed and shouted at him to cut off his horn. The claw flew at the blonde and it seemed that it was about to touch him. There was a blow that scattered dust to the sides. But from there, Xavier flew up with pirouettes, holding his sword in his hands and thereby dodging the claw. The young genius, trying to dodge the attacks, thought that an attempt to cut off the horn could be fatal, but his master, the skilled swordsman, having dodged another blow, flew past the scales. And while the limb tried to strike the swordsman, he tried to slow down and thought that Lloyd was responsible for his words. The blonde took off at great speed, and while his eyes were burning with anger, he screamed his cry at the top of his lungs. The hero tried to stop him with a shout and warn him, and say that it would not be easy at all, but the power of the mana rings is not only in the blow. Xavier, already near the horn, asked what he should do. Raising the blade above his head, he continued, saying that although he was weak, he was fast and at high speed. The swordsman delivered a chopping blow from top to bottom, while putting in mana, and asked if it would be easy. The rings of mana began to dance and intersect over and over again, thus forming a pattern and accelerating faster. The blonde man, gritting his teeth, held the sword to the horn and put in his mana with all his might. Lloyd, seeing this, smiled, clenching his fist, thinking about what they had done, because these were real electric saws made of mana, and after all, it was just a theory. And then he saw Xavier fighting, screaming at the top of his lungs, and thought about how he had never doubted him. Waves of energy diverged from Giga's head in different directions under his screams. The claw again flew at great speed towards the blonde man while he was trying to saw through the horn. But Peepodong stretched his paws forward and was about to jump at the hero's command. The beast hit the Titan's claw with his back, knocking it off and giving him the opportunity to finish what he had started. The swordsman clenched his teeth even harder and sawed with even greater zeal. The appendage was finally separated from the body with the help of a magic saw. The monster began to roar while water flowed out of it. The horn filled with liquid spun at high speed and flew to the ground, splashing water. And after a few moments, the fragment stuck into the ground not far from the hero, who stood pompously on the roof. He screamed with all his might for Xavier that he needed to hit the center from the direction of the tail diagonally to the head. The blonde began to rush at great speed under the Titan's body. He stopped abruptly, holding the ground after hearing that if they hit in this direction. Lloyd frowned and screamed at the top of his lungs that they could buy some time if they did so. The swordsman raised his blade back a little and was preparing to pierce the shell with a thrust. But then a huge monster began to fall dead right on him. Xavier was stunned by this and froze in place. Giga fell with all his weight on the city. Only the rapier of the hero swordsman flew out from under him. The protagonist was extremely horrified by what he saw, and realizing what was happening, he loudly called out to his subordinate. But then we go back a little. The skilled swordsman stood in his stance for a thrust before falling. He clenched his teeth and was about to hit the enemy, ordering him to die. Mana filled his entire body, even his hair, and the guy heard a similar order in his head. But as it turned out, Peepodong was already rushing to his aid. The hamster grabbed the warrior by the collar as he ran, which surprised him greatly. The beast managed to save him right before he fell, and then he slowed down after running a little. Lloyd was glad of his rescue and anxiously clenched his fists and praised his pet. At this time, the familiar tried to stop the swordsman by waving his paws, but he politely apologized and said that he did not understand him. Xavier picked up the rapier from the floor and said that perhaps he was now scolding him for his recklessness. And then he turned to the monster and, standing in a stance, suggested that he stand until victory. Seeing his master in the distance, the Blade Master said that he believed in the protagonist's plan. And he at that moment frowned and thought that Plan D was thought out in a hurry after a successful measurement. But it was very difficult to carry out due to the incredible speed of the Mega Titan. Looking at the colossal size of the enemy, the hero thought that they should carry out this plan because this is the only way to finish him off. The protagonist opened his eyes wide and frowned and decided to combine plans, and he immediately turned to Peepaw, who was standing below. The beast jumped to the owner. Lloyd climbed on it and said that they were going to the place he told him about. Passing by the swordsman, the nobleman shouted to him, mentioning that Giga recognized him as a threat and was moving to the east and offered to lure him into the forest, to which the subordinate immediately agreed. The protagonist was driving at full speed and was worried that they had gained only a little time, although it should be enough. He clenched his teeth and exhaled heavily, thinking that all hope was on the count. And again we are transported 15 minutes back. Cremo watched the monster swimming to the city from the ship and froze. There was horror on his face and he wondered how this was possible and did not understand why the statue did not help. Ginevere carefully approached him from behind and, regretfully looking away, asked him to forgive him because if he had felt it earlier. But the Count, propping up his head, said that he was not to blame for anything, and it was he who was too careless. And then the bearded man remembered the fragments of the statue and wondered how he could believe that some statue would save them from the monster. And then Lloyd swam up to the ship on a snake and said that everything was wrong and the Titan was chasing the statue, and everyone was happy that he was alive. The hero said with a serious look that he was sure that this monster had come to deal with the statue and was going to use his obsession against him. And while Cremo was listening to him attentively, the guy said that while he and Xavier would buy them some time, they would have to. We return to the present again. The Titan without a horn is chasing the swordsman, trying to smear him. He tries to hit him again and again by hitting the ground with his claws. The Blade Master stopped on the ground after another somersault and tried to catch his breath. Getting to his feet, the blonde saw this huge creature in front of him and could not catch his breath. The guy was sweating and thinking that he could not do it anymore and his limit was already close. But then he clenched his teeth and pulled himself together. Xavier suddenly took off, and while running he thought that now his main task was the city, namely to protect the safety of the inhabitants. The Titan demolished everything in its path and ran with its mouth open. The blonde was on its last legs, his mind was already clouded and he could not breathe. The danger was right behind him. And then, when death was almost overtaking him, Lloyd appeared and shouted that he needed to be louder and ordered to go to the statue. The swordsman immediately came to his senses and calmed down. The cart was rushing at great speed, dispersing the dust. Giga saw it and became furious. In front of him was that very hated statue. The hero was smiling from ear to ear astride a cart. The blonde was surprised to realize what he saw in front of him. Peepaw was pulling a cart with a statue with dangling limbs, and the protagonist was shouting insults and calling for an attack. Then the monster reached the extreme level of rage and froze for a moment. The Titan let out a wild scream that was heard throughout the area. Lloyd put a wild smile on his face and thought that he liked this reaction. And then he remembered how they fastened the statue and thought that they even surpassed themselves and that it was still the right decision to trust the Count. The guy immediately called Xavier with an anxious look and said what he would do when he opened the door, and he attacked. The swordsman, frowning as he ran, asked him to tell him the whole plan to the end next time. Having run past each other, the protagonist said with anxiety that this should not happen again. The hamster turned sharply with a whistle and began to run away from the monster. The beast ran away from the Titan with horror on his face, and Lloyd cursed while driving. At this time, Xavier tore off the ground and flew forward, head first, and rushed towards the target. He raised his rapier again to attack under the monster's belly. The blonde man gritted his teeth with all his might and was full of determination. The next attack was a sword strike. Fire energy surrounded the blade, which rushed forward. The swordsman was able to strike at the intersection of the shell and use the explosion. Giga was blown up by the explosion and lifted up. The hero, seeing this, was very surprised and turned around. The Titan stood motionless in the forest and smoked, and the blonde man himself was falling backwards at that moment and watched the consequences of the attack. All he managed to do was simply pierce the shell, but did not damage anything. Seeing this, he thought that he was only able to damage the skin, but a huge amount of force was used. But then the young man, falling down, changed his mind and thought that this was just an excuse and wondered if he was so weak that he could not cope with the protection of people. Suddenly, a loud voice of his lord was heard, who praised him for successfully completing the task. The blonde opened his eyes wide and was very surprised. The protagonist was riding a hamster quickly towards him and said that the Titan's shell. Lloyd's eyes were full of determination and courage, and raising his shovel, the hero said that he was taking on this task. Xavier fell down and thought that he had gathered all his energy for this last blow and now his creation was clouded, he could rest in peace. Lloyd frowned and shouted to leave it to him. Xavier closed his eyes and thought why the Lord said so. Hippo flew forward. The blue-haired man plopped down on him. The hero frowned and told his companion to rest, the city needed to be defended. He thought that although he was running and screaming, he himself was not sure that he would succeed. The guy thought about how he could take the monster away from the city and finish it off. There was no certainty that it would not return back. The Cremal Sea had already become a habitat for megatitans. The monster was destroying the village. Lloyd thought that it had intelligence and could cause even more harm, wanting revenge. Padong ran forward and thought that he was at his maximum and could no longer do more. The hero shouted that the moment had come. The beast slowed down. Lloyd prepared to attack. Padong threw him up to the monster. The brunette swung and thought that everything he could do now seemed obvious. What could he do? He thought that earlier, when he decided to save the city and make his contribution, following the plans, he joined the attack. Lloyd frowned and thought that he should blow it up. He had no other choice. He thought that he needed triple rings to blow it up, but now he only had double rings. Lloyd frowned and started calling the app, the skill window, the clumsy bot. The system window appeared. The hero thought that he needed to level up. The system window said that 190 PR was needed. Lloyd thought that this was a rip-off, but now it didn't matter, he would figure it out later. He pressed the level up button. The guy saw that now 220 points were needed to level up. He thought that it would be difficult for him. Lloyd leveled up one level after another and thought that he would get a discount. Suddenly his pupils narrowed. The system window said that 370 PR was needed to level up. Sweat began to run down his face. His PR balance was 311. Lloyd gritted his teeth and thought that there was nothing he could do about it. It seemed that he had no plans to get into a fight. He had made a reasonable decision. The hero held the shovel and thought what he was even doing, hanging here in the air. Xavier opened his eyes. The brunette held the shovel in his teeth and thought whether he should just use mana and hit, and if there was even a small wound, bite. The blue-haired man closed his eyes. A system window appeared that his sympathy level had increased and was now +5. The hero frowned. A system window appeared that his PR balance was now 391. Lloyd gritted his teeth and thought that the triple rings should appear now. The system window said that the level was obtained. Double rings shone in the sky. Suddenly, another star lit up. A system window appeared that the triple rings technique was learned. Lloyd thrust the shovel into the monster and thought that one ring protected the heart. The monster's paw was rushing towards the ground. Then it sank into the ground. The hero swung and screamed. A stone was flying towards him. It hit him right in the head. Lloyd's eyes widened and thought what it was. He let go of his hand. The guy looked ahead in shock and thought that he couldn't fall. He needed to unhook another ring. One ring appeared in the sky. Then a second one appeared next to it. A third ring appeared next to it. The hero thought that there would be a collision now. Lloyd began to fall. He looked at the sky. There was a powerful explosion. The hero aimed the shovel at the monster's wound. He came closer. There was an explosion. The monster roared. Then it fell to the ground. People looked at the column of smoke. The dust near the dragon's body cleared. The moon was shining. The animals looked at the guy. Xavier opened his eyes. He got up and said that everyone was safe. The blue-haired man looked away. He looked at the dead monster and said that he could answer for his words, but how did he do it? Padong took his little finger. He asked what was wrong with him. Did he really want him to follow him? All the animals ran forward. Lloyd was lying on the ground. Xavier's eyes widened. The hero was staring into space. The guy ran to him and called him. He put his ear to his chest. The blue-haired man frowned. He looked at the master and said that his heart stopped. The bird flapped its wings. It flew over the settlement. The pigeon flew past the building. Arcus looked away when there was a knock. The carrier pigeon saluted him. The brunette took the letter and said that it was from Count Cremo. What was the matter? Suddenly his face darkened. He threw the saddle on the horse. The man pulled on the reins and screamed. Arcus galloped forward and thought about Lloyd. His eyebrows rose, thinking of how many times he had scolded him for putting himself in danger. The letter was addressed to the Baron, informing him that his eldest son had completed the construction in Cremo with incredible success. Marbella had caught up with her husband and was shouting at him to wait for her. How could he just leave without a plan? Arcus looked at her and said that even without stopping, the road was long, which was why only he and Bayern were riding. She replied that he was saying such things. Had he forgotten? She frowned and said that she was much better in the saddle than he was. The letter went on to say that almost immediately after the construction was completed, the city of Cremo came under attack. 3 horsemen were racing forward. The letter said that at this critical moment, Lloyd and his companion Xavier, having gathered all their courage, sacrificed themselves to save the inhabitants of the city. The 3 horsemen were making their way through a snowstorm. The letter said that Lloyd had ended up in a coma. Arcus squinted and thought that Lloyd was the most hated troublemaker, but now his son had become the most hardworking and trustworthy person. The letter continued that they thought it would be important for Arcus to know about this as soon as possible, so he was writing this letter. He would wait to meet the parents of this extraordinary man. The man frowned and thought about his son. The guy smiled and said that he was asking the Baron's permission. He frowned and told the Baron not to worry, he would do well. Lloyd bowed and said that he paid his respects to the Baron. Arcus looked ahead and thought, could this really be his son? The monster stepped on the snow. The riders looked at it in shock. There was a monster in front of them. The horse reared up in fear. The man got off. Baron frowned and said that they could not escape. This was the shortest way, it would buy them some time, and they must find another way to Cremo. Arcus said that he must run. He replied that these creatures were faster than words. As soon as he turned around, they would cut off his head. The monster ran at him. The man turned around and shouted at them to run faster. The monster swung its paw. Baron parried the blow. Arcus turned around and asked for his forgiveness. He said that they would meet in Cremo. The monster began to attack. Baron gripped his sword tighter and parried the attack. Part of his sword flew off. He looked ahead in shock. The monster bit his shoulder. The man took out a dagger and plunged it into the monster's head. It knocked Baron to the ground. He clenched his teeth. The monster bit his shoulder harder. The man screamed in pain. Arcus swung his sword. It pierced the monster. Marbella also ran forward with her sword. She pierced the monster with it. It stood up and screamed. The monster fell to the ground. It was shaking in pain. People looked at it. Arcus approached Baron and asked if he could stand. He replied that he was ashamed of himself as a knight. The man frowned and said that he was also his feudal lord, which meant that he had to be responsible for his people. He turned around when Marbella called him. He asked if she was hurt. His pupils narrowed in shock. In front of them was a whole pack of monsters. Baron stood up. He pulled the sword out of the monster and raised it against the pack. The monsters ran at him. The man ran towards them. Marbella clung to her husband. Suddenly Xavier appeared. He landed on the ground. The monsters looked at him. The guy chopped off one head. He continued chopping off one head after another. The blue-haired boy sheathed his sword. He raised his head and said that he went to meet them just in case. The boy held the sword and asked if they were okay. Baron looked at him in shock and thought that he knew that Xavier had made progress with magic and developed mana, but he was not that strong even before leaving for Cremo. What made him so strong? Xavier looked down. The blue-haired boy approached the hero's parents. Marbella raised her eyebrows and asked if Lloyd was okay. He lowered his head. He looked at his parents and said that he did not know if he was alive or not. Dust was coming from the monster. Xavier looked at the hero in shock. He darkened and thought that he refused to believe it if he was gone now. Lloyd looked into space. The boy took his hand. He closed his eyes and thought that he would lose their estate, his newly acquired home. Xavier leaned over his master. He looked at his hand in shock. The blue-haired man put his hand on the hero's neck and thought that his pulse was beating, but his heart had stopped. He noticed that, albeit weakly, he was breathing. The guy opened his eyes and thought how this was possible. He frowned. He saw triple rings and thought that they were spinning at an incredible speed. Xavier put his hand on the hero's chest and thought that it was difficult for him to know about the state of his heart. He could not check because of the magnetic field. This incredible movement of mana was in his heart, and it was mana that kept him alive. He thought that he had created a triple explosion, and now he understood how the Mega Titan met his end. The blue-haired man looked at the brunette and thought who he was. After some time, the builders were repairing the house. The men were carrying stones. Arcus and Marbella were looking around. Xavier said that Mr. Lloyd was in the Count's house. The doctor was looking after him there, but so far without any special changes. The man raised his eyebrows and said that it all looked scary, just Lloyd and him against the monster that did all this. The guy, without turning around, said that it was all thanks to Lloyd. He walked forward and said that only the master's power helped kill the monster. The parents looked at him worriedly and thought, is it possible that their son has such power? The man behind Arcus asked if they were going to the Count too. The other replied that since he can't help here, wouldn't it be better to go there? Arcus looked at them when one of them said that if it weren't for Lloyd, he would have frozen to death by now. It's hard to imagine how many people he saved while getting to the Mega Titan. Lloyd helped the man get out of the water. The man walked forward and said that he couldn't even move, thought he was going to die and had already given up and was waiting for death. The hero held a shovel and told Belle to absorb the debris so as not to hurt anyone. The woman put her hand to her mouth and said that she thought the fire had started from some fragments of the statue. If it had remained like that, the city would have turned into a sea of fire. Hippo was putting out the fire. The citizen said, "Did everyone see how he appeared out of nowhere and swallowed a huge amount of water and put out the fire?" Xavier and company walked forward. People around were saying that it was hard to imagine how many people were now in debt to Lloyd. Many people were standing outside the Count's house. People bowed their heads and thought that they hoped that the savior of fathers, wives, mothers, all of them, would open their eyes. Lloyd was lying in bed. The citizens turned around when someone shouted, "Were they all crazy?" The guy frowned and said that if that guy hadn't put up that statue, none of this would have happened. He raised a finger and said that if he thought about it, it was all his fault. People were looking at him. The crowd began to discuss and quickly suppressed the man. The hero's heart was beating. A system window appeared that his sacrifice and courage made a great impression on the residents of the city. For such an achievement, he was entitled to a bonus. Lloyd squinted. He opened his eyes. The guy stood up and said that he had a headache. He opened his eye and said that he remembered how recklessly he used the triple explosion. Was he even alive now? A system window appeared that if he were dead, he would not be able to see dreams. Lloyd looked at the system window and asked how this was possible. Wasn't his heart part of the settings? He was told that he would gradually learn everything. A system window appeared that he should pay attention to more important things. Someone entered his room. Xavier looked at him in shock. The brunette looked at him and said that he was just in time. He frowned and asked when they were promised to pay for the work. The blue-haired man looked at him and said that he saw that he was already better. He smiled. Lloyd raised an eyebrow when his name was called. His parents ran to him. They hugged him. The man cried and said he was fine, what a wretch he was, and his mother said it was a relief. Did he know how worried they were? Arcus thought it didn't matter if it was really their Lloyd. He was just grateful he was alive. The boy smiled. After a while, Royal Road Magenta. The man said, "It says here that the Mega Titan is dead and no longer a danger." Those are the last words in Count Cremo's message. He bowed to the king. He said that it was very interesting that such an unusual young man had appeared on his lands. The man bowed when the king said to send a message to the Frontier estate inviting him in that night. Queen Alicia looked ahead and said that she would decide whether what was described was true or not after a personal meeting. Notification: word of your courage and sacrifice is spreading throughout the country. The hero crossed his arms and stared at the system window. For increasing your reputation in society, you are entitled to bonus RP. You receive plus 15 points. The guy clenched his fists and smiled happily. New skill, Mana Heart, accumulating a high concentration of mana in the heart. The young man touched his chest and thought that it was no wonder that he had so much energy, although he had been in a coma for a month. The fact that mana appeared in his heart meant one thing. The brown-haired man frowned and realized that working with a shovel would be much easier. The system asked if that was all he cared about. The boy was surprised that she disdainfully treated hardworking workers. A message appeared in front of him with an apology. The system reported that his mana heart appeared not due to training, but because of the shock wave from the explosion. Based on this, his mana heart has unique abilities. The hero's eyes widened in surprise. Exclusive skill option, impact compensation. Even if it is impossible to defend, the option allows you to minimize the impact of the explosion. Lloyd narrowed his eyes and thought that this meant that he could use triple strike whenever he wanted. The young man clenched his fist and was glad that the mining would go faster. The system asked him to say something cooler. The nobleman asked what could be cooler than work, or was she now also belittling mining? An apology followed immediately. The reason why the mana heart needs protection from the effects of the explosion is that mana is like an ammunition depot. Just bring a match to it and everything will blow up. Since the consequences of the blow are catastrophic, if you do not protect your heart, then get ready to say goodbye to life. But at that moment, the hero did not have a mana heart. Thanks to this, he is still alive. The shockwave settled in his heart. The brown-haired man touched his chest and noticed that, trying to save his life, the wave turned into a mana heart. The guy sighed and thought that while his mana heart was diligently developing, he did not notice it, believing that waving a shovel was much more useful. Sometimes it does not hurt to play the fool. Count Cremo climbed into the carriage and, apologizing for the wait, suggested that they leave immediately. The hero looked intently to the side and licked his lips. The carriage moved along the pavement. Lloyd propped his cheek on his fist, looking out the window, and asked how much money would be needed to restore the building and the road. The count bowed his head and replied that the costs could exceed the city's monthly budget. The young man put on a serious face and said that if the Mega Titan had not died, the amount could have exceeded the annual budget. The man winced and, frowning, asked what he meant by that. The hero crossed his legs and muttered that compared to the annual budget, the payment he received could not even be called pocket money. The guy added that the statue erected to fight the Mega Titan had brought about such a disaster. The interlocutor silently lowered his chin. Lloyd continued that one cannot blame someone for their choice, because this choice was made by nature itself. The count began to sweat. The aristocrat drawled that it was still good that there were people willing to sacrifice themselves. The young man smiled and remembered that he had overheard the servants saying that those who tried in the interests of the townspeople, regardless of status, were definitely entitled to monetary compensation. He was interested to know how strong the interests of the townspeople should be. Primo froze and said 1.5 times. There was a pause in the carriage. The man frowned and asked if that was enough. The interlocutor replied that there had been a misunderstanding and he had not asked for more money. The guy looked out the window and said that he now knew that for a feudal lord, the lives of the townspeople were only worthy of an increase of 1.5 times the total amount. The count shuddered. The wheels clattered on the pavement. The man frowned and said that he was doubling. The brown-haired man did not tear himself away from contemplating the view outside the window. Sweat was pouring down the interlocutor's face. He looked nervously at the hero and exclaimed that he was tripling. Lloyd's sinister smile was visible in the reflection of the glass, which gave the count goosebumps. Primo looked warily at the outstretched hand. The brown-haired man smiled softly and said that he was impressed by such a reasonable expenditure of funds. He would consider this compensation and put the money in the right direction. The man shook his hand and agreed. The feudal lord thought that this was a crazy, strange extortion of pure water. However, he did not hate the guy, did not even get irritated, looking at his satisfied smile. The townspeople turned around, noticing the count's carriage. People surrounded them, shouting the main character's name. The young man smiled awkwardly and thought that in Korea he was just a piece of trash. Primo smiled and said that there were even magic balls installed on the podium that amplify the sound. All the residents really wanted to listen to the guy. The hero looked away and thought that he would have to say something motivating and heroic. A huge crowd looked at the young man standing on the stage and shouted his name. Lloyd sighed and took the ball, wondering how many people were there. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him in anticipation. The guy took a deep breath and thought that if he could get money from everyone present, that would be great. To the surprised looks, the brown-haired man raised his finger and asked if the people had heard about the heating system. The dumbfounded spectators stared at him in silence. The young man looked around and, covering his face with his hand, muttered that they were not aware. The hero put his hands on the table and addressed the older generation, suffering from sore joints in the winter, and the parents, worried that their children would get sick. The townspeople listened in bewilderment as the aristocrat asked them how much time they had wasted trying to light a fire. Lloyd frowned and shouted that an hour or two, and if they were already over 50, then they had already wasted 15 years of their lives. The count looked sideways at the young man, who was yelling about the heating system, in shock. The brown-haired man frowned and showed on his hands how much the quality of life of all the townspeople would increase. The guy closed his eyes and added that if they wanted to get more information, then welcome to the Frontier estate. With that, he finished his advertisement and turned around. Primo turned around and thought that there was a reason why he couldn't hate this young man. He was thorough in financial matters, persistent but reasonable. Besides, the young man did everything he had to. Instead of hating him, the count wanted to make him his subordinate. It would be too unreasonable to keep him in such a wilderness where he came from. The Frontier estate, which would be his sweet gold mine, and the chief knight here was Master Baron. Honest, sincere, hardworking. All good, but compared to his diligence, his knightly skills were average, maybe even worse. The hero thought that this was a problem. Lloyd looked at his interlocutor in surprise. Baron, with a cast on his left arm, laid out the sheets of paper in front of him and reported that all the preparations were complete. The list of land distribution was presented in this document. They decided to deal with the problem of the lack of labor on the farms, while the representatives of the Orc tribe would fully engage in the mines. The man closed his eyes and added that thanks to the neighboring estate, they managed to conclude a large contract for the installation of a heating system. With a 30% discount, the net profit rate would be 10%, but given the turnover of coal, the final net profit rate exceeded 50%. The warrior wanted to continue talking about waterproofing and restoration, but the young man asked him to slow down. The guy smiled tensely and asked if he had really been doing all this while he was gone. Baron looked questioningly at the young gentleman and replied that he had simply fulfilled his request to keep an eye on everything while he was gone. A young man entered the door and reported to the main knight that the last level of the heating system had been laid. An inspection was required. The swordsman turned around and said that he would be there in 30 minutes. The protagonist watched as Baron checked the work done. The man smiled and praised the workers for doing everything without a single mistake. The subordinates smiled sheepishly. The knight asked them to take into account that it was for moments like these that he had been yelling at them. They were now the most important members of their team. Lloyd stared at him in shock. He admired how literate the man was. This guy was born at the wrong time. If they were in Korea, he would have been the CEO of some conglomerate. The young man decided that he definitely needed to be rewarded. Notification: the Frontier Estate's home floor heating system has been completed. The Frontier-style floor heating system will appear in the pages of the continent's history. A huge amount of RP will be awarded for incredible achievements in construction. Bonus RP plus 400. It turned out that such a large flow of orders for the heating system was the work of the Baron and Baroness. It turned out that these people had something to offer besides the estate. Since the moment of his birth, he had been lucky, and now, thanks to the new generation, many will either cry or laugh. The hero threw the shovel over his shoulder and watched the progress of construction together with the knight. Xavier raised his head and assumed that such a large storage facility would be needed to store coal. The young man agreed, because endless streams of coal awaited them. He smiled and thought that, thanks to the construction fee, he was able to pay off more than half of their debt. And he also had water checks from their neighbor waiting for him. Lloyd grinned crookedly and was glad that he was close to a carefree life. The swordsman glanced sideways at his grin. The guy did not express emotions, but he thought that this facial expression, which he saw from time to time, irritated him and awakened the desire to hit the master. The doom sounded. The interlocutors turned around, and the brown-haired man asked where the sound was coming from. Xavier replied that he had never heard it before, but the trumpet usually announced the arrival of an imperial envoy. A man on horseback, surrounded by knights and servants, was approaching them. The hero raised an eyebrow, not understanding where an imperial envoy could come from. A red carpet was laid out on the ground, and the guest elegantly jumped down from his horse onto it. He tossed the scroll with an elegant gesture and, catching it with one hand, unrolled it. The pages applauded him with admiration. The Baron's family knelt, and Lloyd mentally asked to get to the point. He clenched his teeth and realized that he was about to die from this strange feeling. The guest looked at the scroll and read that, since ancient times, great kings did something there for the sake of peace and comfort of the aristocracy and other citizens. The young man frowned and assumed that it was Cremo. In the background, the envoy muttered his speech. The man solemnly declared that, inspired by such thoughts, Her Majesty said, the two brave heroes who defeated the Mega Titan must personally appear before her and be rewarded for their achievements. Notification: the Baron's interest has increased by 9 points. You have been awarded 90 RP. Arcus held back tears and said that he was so proud of his son. The brown-haired man clenched his teeth and thought that he was grateful for the points, but this was a very bad sign. He had already been through this in the army. It was enough to simply do the job without problems, but you can't do better than necessary, and you only have to break this rule. The hero remembered how, having learned about his knowledge and skills, he was forced to build various houses, saunas, and barracks. If the young man got involved with the monarch, then you can forget about the quiet life of a nobleman in the province. The messenger opened his mouth wide and exclaimed that the orders were for Lloyd Frontera and his guard to leave for the King's Road immediately. The boy's eyes filled with tears, realizing that he should have stopped at the compaction of the seabed. That damn lobster had cursed him. He wondered what he was going to do now. If the monarch chose him, he would have to toil for him for the rest of his life. He could try to play dumb, but then they might chop off his head. The carriage drove through the forest, surrounded by guards. The hero's face sank, looking down with an empty gaze. Xavier looked at the gentleman and noted that he looked as if he had been sentenced to death. The young man agreed and looked questioningly at his interlocutor when the latter said that this was unexpected. The knight crossed his arms and said that if it were Mr. Lloyd, he would be in 7th heaven, thinking that he could get rich at the monarch's expense. The brown-haired man looked at the swordsman carefully and thought that he had information. The identity of Queen Magenta, her future, the situation on the royal road. If the hero uses all this information, then he has a chance. Xavier is right. If the situation turned out this way, then he should use it to his advantage. The guy smiled decisively and thought that this would be needed against the royal road. After a while, the main character and his guard bowed, greeting the queen. The ruler ordered them to raise their heads, and the brown-haired man looked at her carefully. A red-haired woman in a cloak stood above him. Lloyd smiled tensely and thought that at some point he was even scared. Her presence was no joke. The brown-haired man lowered his head and greeted the queen as a true mistress of the royal road. The interlocutor arched an eyebrow and said that she thought the second guy was an aristocrat. The hero froze, already accustomed to such a reaction. The woman smiled and said that she could feel the flow of unique mana inside Xavier. She added that the guy looked like he could challenge her. The blonde closed his eyes and politely replied that he was just a guard. The young man frowned and thought that the queen understood at one glance that the knight was special. As expected, one of the two best sword masters in the kingdom. Alicia looked down intently. You can't mess around with her. The woman said that she heard about his success from Count Cremo, so she praised him for his courage and sacrifice. She stood in front of the guests without a shadow of a smile. The queen said that she would not judge a person only by someone else's stories, and would believe it when she saw it herself. The hero frowned and thought that he didn't even doubt it. The redhead narrowed her eyes and said that she would personally evaluate his skills. The young man smiled and realized that this was a special opportunity to receive a royal order. Alicia asked what in the current situation and the time they live in most needs urgent reconstruction on the royal road Magenta. The hero lowered his head and noted that they decided to start with riddles. He grinned because he knew the plot of the entire novel. The queen looked at him and thought that the guy would immediately notice it if he was gifted. but if he was not able to see it, then she would not be able to accept him. They exchanged glances. In magenta, the crumbling conservatism of this kingdom needs urgent reconstruction. The brown-haired man looked down and answered that the Magina River, which crosses the royal road, needs to build a new outpost. The woman arched an eyebrow in displeasure. The hero did not raise his head and thought that she must not like his answer because she expected something else. But, knowing her character, the woman will not stop there. A character with a powerful and absolute force. Trying to be equal with everyone and acting according to conscience, the queen gives everyone a chance to share their opinion. Alicia narrowed her eyes and asked what the reason was. The young man frowned and said that someone might think that the main palace needed urgent reconstruction. The redhead frowned. The guy added that a long time ago, an evil dragon attacked the tower twice. In order to prevent a third attack, the roof of the main building was made flatter and wider. For fear that the roof could be completely destroyed, the main building of the kingdom became incredibly heavy. Lloyd leaned on his knee and said that this weight pressed on the columns and the foundation of the building, weakening them more and more each time. However, the moment to correct this deficiency would not come soon. He believed that this was not the most urgent task. The woman looked at him with displeasure but remained silent. She thought that this was a very impudent young man. Even knowing what answer was in her mind, he dared to give a different one. Alicia lifted her chin. The boy smiled and thought that he knew that the queen knew that he himself had given a different answer, although he knew what was on her mind. The redhead continued to look, realizing that the interlocutor knew that she knew that even if in her head she had meant something else, he still answered incorrectly. The smile widened on the hero's face. He knew that the queen knew that he knew that she knew that even if in her mind she already had an answer, he answered differently. The system begged this crazy idiot to stop. The queen chuckled, mentally asking if the boy had decided to play with her. The hero looked at her innocently and thought that he was only asking for food, a new order and payment. Lloyd said that the current bridge over the Magina River had already been repaired 12 times. It cannot withstand the spring flood and collapses from time to time. When the bridge falls again, the usual way of life of the people will be disrupted and the monarch will again need a lot of money. This particular structure needs reconstruction due to natural phenomena. The brown-haired man closed his eyes and said that if only the queen could instruct them to do this, they would build a bridge that would not be afraid of either floods or ice drifts. The guy was talking about a modern suspension bridge. The woman frowned, noticing that this arrogant and reckless man was judging her. The aristocrat swallowed, and the knight glanced at him nervously. The interlocutor pressed her lips and thought that the more they talked, the more she liked it. Alicia asked to continue talking about the bridge he wanted to build. The hero grinned and thanked her. The young man knew that she would like it. Flatterers are hated, but those who are confident in themselves and their beliefs are rewarded with generous faith. Lloyd began to babble, describing all the delights of his idea, and the queen stopped him, explaining that she was suddenly no longer interested in it. That's Queen Magenta for you. However, she will be betrayed by the one she loves the most. She will lose her arm and become a bloody monarch. But this story will happen only in 3 years. Now the woman is a good queen, ready to listen to even the poorest peasant. The redhead looked at the guest and asked what would happen if this bridge fell. The guy thought that in this case he would pack his things and go overseas, but he replied that she could chop off his head. The brown-haired man looked up and asked to maintain the status of his family while this bridge stood. The queen grinned and noticed that he still managed to make her laugh. She waved her hand and said that she would allow him to do as he wanted. The woman promised him a decent reward and the preservation of the status of his family. The hero crawled closer to her and handed over a scroll, explaining that he needed to sign a contract. Alicia frowned and was indignant. Did the guy really not believe her words? She was surprised that this guy had prepared a contract in advance. The hero bowed and explained that the document stated that if he was insincere in his words, he would suffer the most severe punishment. He asked to consider this as a necessary measure coming from a modest man who could not be trusted. The interlocutor looked at him in bewilderment, but obediently signed. Alicia thought that she had a feeling that she was being drawn into something, but she was not angry at all. The young man bent over, sticking out his butt, and thanked her. The woman asked why he stuck out his butt. The hero explained that he physically could not lower his head lower in front of her, so he tried to lower himself as much as possible. The redhead asked to lower his butt, not wanting to see her. Lloyd and the knight walked down the corridor, accompanied by the butler. The young man put his foot on his toe and twirled. The brown-haired man made a smug face and pointed at the scroll, showing with all his appearance that this guy tore everyone apart right in front of the queen and got the contract. Xavier frowned and thought that the lord's rude behavior almost deprived him of his head. He would not be able to block the sword of the sword master, so there is no need to cross the line. Imperial Knight Kale looked at the queen and noted that Lloyd was smart and did great calculations. The woman smiled, sitting on the throne, and agreed, adding that the young man was more assertive than she imagined. The man frowned and said that it seemed to him that the ruler was unhappy about something. The interlocutor answered in the affirmative and explained that the guest was trying to outsmart her from the very beginning. Alicia smirked and added that he did it so trivially that it was even cute. A couple of days later, the hero threw a bag over his back. The knight approached him and asked if he could really handle it alone. The brown-haired man turned around and asked why he needed security in a kingdom with an unrivaled security system. He made a face and said that being anywhere with Xavier was extremely uncomfortable. Even earlier, when inspecting the area, he could not concentrate because crowds of girls were running after the knight. The swordsman looked at the young man and asked him to convey his warmest wishes to Mr. Julian. The hero waved his hand and replied that he understood. Julian Frontera is Lloyd's younger brother, who is currently studying at the Royal Academy. Before going to the Royal Road, the Baron packed a bunch of warm clothes to give to him. The aristocrat walked down the street and wondered what was in the novel. At this time, the Baron's family was completely broke, and they were unable to pay for his education, as a result of which he was thrown out of the dormitory. And Julian died, having run into a robber while wandering the streets at night. The brown-haired man smiled and decided that this would definitely not happen now, and how cool he was that he saved someone else's life. He moved towards the academy to go meet his little brother, whose face he did not even know. The Royal Academy of the Kingdom of Magentano. The hero looked down, where a disgruntled green-eyed boy was staring at him. He asked what the boy had come for. The brown-haired man narrowed his eyes, thinking that his brother was the same age as Xavier, but he was just a child. From the angry look on Julian's face, one could tell that Lloyd was a real asshole. The guy decided that he would not suspect anything if he did not treat him kindly. He threw the bag to the boy and said that his mother had packed it for him. Julian frowned, not believing that he was not called a bastard idiot, and that his brother had come on behalf of his mother. Notice, because of your overly kind behavior, the boy doesn't trust you. The hero was indignant. What kindness was there in his behavior? Behaving like this Lloyd is very tiring. The brown-haired man turned around and said that he was leaving. The boy frowned and was surprised that he didn't even hit him. Notice, suspicions are strengthened by such humane behavior. The guy was amazed that he even called the child a punk, almost hit him. The hero stopped, remembering how the Baroness asked him to have dinner with his brother. He scratched his head irritably under the boy's intent gaze. The brown-haired man turned around and asked if there was any decent restaurant around. The interlocutor answered that there was, but so what? The guy said that he would buy him something to eat. He diligently added the word punk at the end of each sentence. Julian asked why. The guy sighed and explained that his mother asked him to. The boy frowned. Later in the restaurant, the brothers sat at the table, facing each other. Julian squinted at the menu and muttered that he would like something simple. The hero raised an eyebrow and asked to order something more expensive, while there was still the opportunity to dine in such a place. There was a pause while the child stared at his brother. The brown-haired man quickly corrected himself and called him a punk. The boy tensed up and was surprised that the guy forgot to call him a punk right away. The child sweated and said that he would have a dish from the chef. Julian did not understand why the interlocutor behaved normally and did not swear at everyone and did not kick him. The hero looked at the waiter and ordered 2 dishes from the chef. The man bowed and asked if the aristocrat would like something to drink. Lloyd replied that he quit drinking, so there was no need. The boy was amazed that a man who drank all day long had given up alcohol. A couple of days ago, a certain man came from Wangxiang. He told a story about the trading city of Cremo being attacked by a mega titan. The boy couldn't believe that the man who got rid of the monster was Lloyd. The child simply didn't believe it, because his brother had neither intelligence nor abilities. Julian thought that it was either a rumor or the boy had taken the merits of his knight for himself. The hero calmly ate a steak. The child frowned and thought that this was strange and unusual, even if good. But in front of him was like a completely different person. Suddenly, a blonde man came up and hit the boy on the head. Lloyd looked up. The stranger looked at the child and asked why he was sitting there. Julian sweated and babbled that this was just how things turned out. The interlocutor hit the boy on the head and asked what he had been taught in law class. He continued to beat the child, asking if he could really break the law whenever he wanted. The protagonist put the cutlery on the table and glanced to the side. The offender said that the Baron's family did not eat in crowded places because it could cause unnecessary problems. The students at the next table laughed, and the bully insulted the boy. The cook and the waiter also pretended that nothing was happening. Lloyd crossed his arms and thought that even at the academy, the status of the family was more important than knowledge, and it was not right for the son of a poor estate in the wilderness to be so close to the leadership. The guy thought that if he helped his brother now, it would only complicate his life at the academy. Moreover, the boy himself was sending a signal for him to stay out of it, albeit with tears in his eyes. He noticed bruises on his arms. The blonde grinned and said that in his house there was a racanada recognized throughout the kingdom. The young man added that he had to at least achieve this in order to have the right to eat here. The brown-haired man looked up in surprise and remembered Viscount Racona. The hero leaned on his hands, making calculations. His face twisted into a grin. Calculations completed. The bully turned around when asked what his father did. Lloyd stood up and walked up to the bully. The student raised his eyebrows and boasted that his father was the wise and humble Viscount Racona, who had achieved everything on his own. He grimaced and demanded that the punk's relatives get lost. At that moment, he received a good slap. The young man was spitting from the blow, and the tooth left the chat. The bully did a pirouette in the air and flew into the wall. The hero looked at his hand and thought that the offensive skill Mana Slap worked without fail. The system noticed that he did not have such a skill. Another student stood up from the table and shouted, "How dare some stinking idiot treat their first-class student like that." The next slap went to him. The hero did not skimp on his dentist's tricks, knocking out everyone's teeth. A second-year student nicknamed Ripping Fist approached him and advised him to prepare for death. His fate was the same. Two twins with dyed hair approached and asked who dared to pick on their people. Someone exclaimed that the brothers called the double horns of the Black Dragon had arrived. The guy wouldn't dare lift a finger in front of their cool combinations. Lloyd crossed his arms and attacked with a double slap. He walked up to the boy who had just been extolling the virtues of the twins and gave him a lymphatic drainage massage to his face. The other two students, who had been laughing at first, cowered and hid their faces in the table. Trembling, they muttered that they hadn't said anything. The brown-haired man loomed over them and reminded them that they had laughed. One swing, and the Tooth Fairy got 2 new trophies. Racona's son, with his teeth knocked out, swung and struck him in the face. He bared his teeth and asked how he liked the mana blow delivered by such a brilliant fighter. Diego Racona, 21. The boy stared ahead, dumbfounded. Later, the young man regretted it. The hero licked the blood from his face and laughed ominously. That blow was clearly not worth delivering. Lloyd bared his teeth and, grabbing the student by the chest, hit him hard with his head. The blonde went limp in his arms. The aristocrat lifted the bully up, and he begged him to stop. The hero repeated the move right in the forehead. Julian looked at his brother with concern and thought that he had completely lost his mind. What an idiot the boy was, even for a second thinking that he was normal. The child turned to the place where the deputy director stood, but there was no one there anymore. Lloyd slammed Diego into the wall. He smirked and muttered that the boy must not understand what was happening and why he was being beaten. The brown-haired man pressed the victim tighter and mimicked his words about Viscount Racona. The student muttered that he had crossed the line by insulting his parents. The hero thoroughly wiped the wall with the boy's face and shouted that he had no special position to mock others. He knocked on the wall with Diego's face and asked why he had to teach such simple things to an ill-mannered cretin. All because the blonde doesn't have someone next to him who will beat the crap out of him every time. The aristocrat pointed to the bloody trace of his face on the wall and asked what it looked like. The next second, he hit the guy again, saying that this is the 66th gate of hell for such trash who wastes oxygen in vain. Julian grabbed his brother and asked him to stop right now, otherwise he will kill the student. The boy closed his eyes and wondered why he was covering for him at all, because it will be worse for him later. He looked up at his brother, who asked if the kid was really afraid that he would be bullied even more later. Lloyd smiled and asked him not to worry, because a corpse couldn't hurt him. Julian turned pale, not understanding why the guy looked like he was proud of himself. The hero punched the bully in the stomach and thought that in high school he saw enough bastards like that who did whatever they wanted. He rejected any form of mercy for him. The blonde coughed. After all, the fear of death was something special. The voice ordered to stop immediately. The guards surrounded them. The man frowned and exclaimed that this was a sacred academy, which was under the patronage of Her Majesty the Queen, and this was treason. The hero straightened up, holding Diego by the hair. Julian looked at him in fear, wondering if his brother was capable of attacking the dean too. The brown-haired man bowed and introduced himself. The boy frowned, not understanding why he was so calm, as if he was preparing for this. Lloyd smiled and bowed, apologizing for causing such a commotion. He looked slyly at the dean and said that he was only restoring the trampled honor of Her Highness. The man frowned and replied that this was nonsense, and who would dare to defame the honor of the queen. The guy replied that it was Racon's son who did it, and his younger brother suffered from bullying and insults. The hero looked at the deputy, who had seen everything, and asked if he really had nothing to say. The man began to sweat while the brown-haired man was telling him that he had no desire to stop him. They didn't need to understand why he hadn't stopped. It was because the staff of this academy was recruited on the recommendations of the nobility. That's why they didn't want to see anything except these very nobility. So the students felt free and dared to behave as they wanted. Those who grew up here and brought the academy to such madness. And it's not just the students, the teachers are good too. The men looked at him tensely. The hero thought that he would never have stayed away if he had learned that Julian was being bullied. He hadn't paid attention to them until now, since he was just the son of a poor baron, so there was little point in his helping. The boy narrowed his eyes and thought that by insulting his younger brother, they had insulted him. The dean frowned and asked what this had to do with Her Majesty. Lloyd put his hand in his pocket and said that by insulting his brother, they had insulted him. He took out and opened the object. The academics stared at it in shock. The brown-haired man smiled and said that it was a special royal pass for an important guest. Suddenly, even a glow engulfed him, and everyone knelt down, saluting the queen. The hero put his hands in his pockets and headed for the exit, since they understood what had just happened here. The dean narrowed his eyes and thought that this retarded idiot did not know that the status of a royal guest extended to only one person. They could punish Julian after he left. The man shuddered, looking at the boy. The hero grinned menacingly. The dean quickly lowered his head and thought that he was trying to say that he would finish him off if he pulled some trick. Lloyd looked at his brother and hurried him. They walked down the corridor together. The boy glanced sideways at the hero and asked where they were going. The brown-haired man replied that they needed to go to the administrative center so that the young man could take an academic leave. He turned around in surprise at his brother, who had stopped. Julian frowned and asked how far he was going to go to satisfy his ego. Now they would put even more pressure on him at the academy, and he wouldn't be allowed to study either. The other man smiled and replied that it would be hard for him to study in such an environment anyway, so he should cool down and start training. Lloyd grinned and said that there was a saying that the best way to build muscles was through physical labor. Night had fallen on the royal palace. The rooms of important guests. Xavier looked at the boy sitting opposite him and asked him to think about Mr. Lloyd's advice because it would lead to good results. The child objected that it was about his good-for-nothing brother. The knight looked at his interlocutor intently and asked if he didn't trust his words either. Julian stared at him in surprise. The swordsman told him that the hero had single-handedly dealt with a mega titan and even withstood a deadly blow. The aristocrat had built a road and a water supply system, and had also started mining coal in the mines and made friends with wild orcs. The young man listened in shock. The knight added that Lloyd had managed to pay off most of the baron's unbearable debt, and had achieved all this single-handedly. The warrior looked at the boy and asked him to trust him. Now it was his older brother who ran the estate. The hero froze in the hallway, reaching for the door handle. He rubbed his nose in embarrassment, hearing the knight's words. Julian sat down on the couch and replied that he really wanted to believe his words, but it was hard to accept that this alcoholic and asshole had changed so much. The interlocutor agreed that the gentleman was stupid and arrogant. The child said that his brother was real trash. The swordsman added that it was hard to believe that he was even human. Lloyd froze with an empty look. The student looked at the knight and asked if it was possible for someone to change so much. The blonde replied that it was impossible. Xavier frowned and said that he thought that this person was someone else, just looked like Mr. Lloyd. The hero frowned. There was a pause. The boy looked at the interlocutor in surprise and asked if someone was using his brother's body with black magic. The knight closed his eyes and replied that it could be so, if such a thing was even possible. The brown-haired man frowned as the swordsman explained that there was such a theory in the book, but in order to transfer a soul to another body, a very large amount of mana was required. He secretly decided to test it. Xavier said that Lloyd's soul was connected by a very strong flow of mana. The hero opened his mouth, surprised that the warrior actually did this. The student frowned and asked if the soul of another was there. The brown-haired man narrowed his eyes, waiting for an answer. The knight closed his eyes and said that the body and soul felt natural, as if one whole. The nobleman sighed in relief. The swordsman looked at the boy and noted that these were just stupid assumptions. The child objected that it was even more stupid to think that he had changed so much. The hero stared ahead and thought that there was no way in hell that Xavier could not sense his presence behind the door. He must have wanted the master to hear it. The boy shuddered when he heard his younger brother say that he knew about the family's debts. The boy looked away and muttered that he thought he was the only one trying hard. All this time, his brother had done so much to cover the debt. It was easier for a child. Julian smiled and said that he had to admit that his older brother had saved their estate. Notification: Julian's sympathy towards you has increased by 2 points. Bonus RP received 28. Sympathy towards you minus 59. The hero grinned and thought that he could get points for his brother too. The system wrote that the ice in the little brother's heart had cracked. The boy replied that it was time to move on. He entered the room and told his brother that it was time to begin. Lloyd smiled and reminded him that he had promised training. The first step was to prepare the suspension cables of the bridge. The nobleman pounded the shovel to crush the soil and knead the pizza dough a meter thick. The second step: finish preparing the pizza by throwing in other types of soil and rocks as ingredients. The third step was to feed everything to Belle. The fourth step was to release the steel from the snake passage. The fifth step was to roll the steel into 120 bundles of wires using pipadong when the steel cooled. The rope was complete. The hero handed his brother a shovel and said that that was it. He pointed and said that this process was the starting point of the entire construction. If you screw up here, it would be the end. The boy added that in addition to the estate's debt, this would also decide his fate at the academy. The boy stared at his brother in shock, clutching the tool. Julian looked awkwardly at the brown-haired man and asked why he should be trusted with such an important task. The hero turned around and said that this was a very important task, so such a smart and responsible young man should complete it. He quickly added an insult at the end. The child looked at his brother in surprise and was surprised that he called him a son of a bitch again. Lloyd headed for the exit with a smile, and the night followed. The brown-haired man was carrying rolled-up plans and was thinking that building a suspension bridge with the technology of this era was not an easy task. He was sure that he could not cope alone. The guy resolutely looked ahead and was going to borrow a power beyond technology. He looked at the building, from the pipes of which smoke was pouring. The royal dwarf craftsman Corgidus tore himself away from the bottle and refused. The hero smiled and noted that he had not said anything yet. The interlocutor took a sip and said that he did not want to listen to anything. The brown-haired man grinned and thought that everything was as described in the novel, an old and mean old man. If he was not interested, he would not even move, even by decree of the queen. However, the guy also had an ace up his sleeve. Lloyd unfolded the drawing and said that it was a plan for building a bridge over the Magenta River, and it was called the structure of the Rafter Truss. The gnome threatened with a bottle and exclaimed that he was not interested in human projects. Suddenly, he squinted and looked at the drawing. The hero rolled up the drawing paper and muttered that then it was worth leaving this topic. The aristocrat dramatically turned to the exit, saying that he would look for another workshop. Corgidus put the bottle on the table and stopped him. He said that if the overall structure was not strong enough, what would happen then? The man clarified whether the guy had designed it. The hero froze and replied that the structure would fall apart, the bridge would collapse, and all the people on it would die, and the guy would take responsibility for their deaths and be hanged on the guillotine. The dwarf frowned. Lloyd turned around with wild eyes and muttered that if only Corgidus would take up the matter. The interlocutor shuddered in amazement and began to sweat. He exclaimed, "What kind of threat was that?" The brown-haired man smiled and replied that it was more of an appeal to conscience. The dwarf asked if they were trying to intimidate him. The craftsman was breathing heavily. He extended his hand and asked to take a closer look. Corgidus looked at the plans while the guy stood opposite. Finally, the dwarf crossed his arms and said that in the entire kingdom he was the only one who could do this. If he trusted someone else with this, then expect great trouble. The aristocrat narrowed his eyes and said that that was why he was trying to put pressure on him, that is, to beg. The interlocutor muttered that this criminal idiot was trying to impress him. Corgidus looked at the guy and asked if he had any plans to attract his interest, since he was smart enough to design this. The hero, without changing his expression, replied that he had no choice but to rely on the kind-hearted master craftsman. The man asked him to stop making such a face. Lloyd made a perfect bow and thanked him, hearing that the dwarf agreed to participate in the project. Meanwhile, Julian continues to make cables with the support of mystical creatures. The bridge deck is being made in the royal workshop, and he and Xavier begin to build the main tower. The hero and the swordsman stuck tools into the ground and used explosive technology. Someone approached them and demanded that they immediately stop construction. The man with the guards raised his hand and shouted how dare they mislead the royal family and plunder the national wealth. Lloyd frowned and asked again with displeasure. Two men bowed before the queen, asking for leniency. One of them frowned and exclaimed that the bridge over the Magenta River had stood for 30 years. The guy was doing unnecessary things to get hold of the royal money. They asked to punish the swindler and return the money to the royal treasury. Alicia looked at them intently. The queen with the knight, the protagonist with Xavier, and two disgruntled nobles gathered at the negotiating table. The woman said that she wanted to hear the arguments of both sides. She leaned on her arm and suggested starting with the guild. Victor, the leader of the construction guild of the royal capital Magenta, frowned and said that the bridge built by the previous leader of the guild had stood for 30 years. The wedge-shaped support of the bridge distributes the powerful current of the river. He added that it was unthinkable to think that such a bridge would collapse. By saying this, the guy insults the guild and the queen. The hero looked at him indifferently and thought that, by the way, the bridge was already falling apart. The brown-haired man squinted and remembered that in the novel The Knight of Iron and Blood there is a chapter that tells about the confrontation between the government forces and the rebels. And at that time, a heavy rain begins to fall, which washes away the bridge, and it falls. However, the young man cannot talk about the future. The queen looked at him and asked him to express his point of view. The guy said that he would like to talk to the official sitting next to him, and not the guild leader. Lloyd grinned and asked how much he received. The man turned pale and asked again, and his partner shuddered. The official slammed his fist on the table and shouted how dare he throw false accusations right in front of the queen. The aristocrat smiled and thought that the interlocutor was literally shouting, "I got my money." In Korea, any fool knows what happens when politicians meet merchants. Either the politicians set up the merchants, or the merchants bribe the officials and get support. In this case, it's most likely the latter. They plan to take over the money by depriving them of the right to operate. The brown-haired man looked at the ruler. The woman frowned and said that she thought he was a smart guy, but he had just made a terrible mistake. The young man swallowed nervously. The men smiled contentedly, while Alicia was indignant that the guy dared to accuse a royal official without evidence. She frowned and ordered them to prepare for the trial. The hero was tied up, and the executioner was already standing over him. The queen looked down and said that he had insulted her and her subjects with his lies. The woman added that she wanted to restore their trampled honor. Xavier looked at the master in shock, and the animal sat on his shoulders in fear. The knight placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Alicia lifted her chin and asked if the boy had anything to say. The hero lowered his head and said that a sinful man destroys his parents. Xavier frowned. The two men bowed to the queen and said that everyone gets what they deserve. The knight clutched his sword. The redhead said that from now on she would prove her subjects' innocence. The official and the guild leader sweated and asked again. Several mages surrounded the man, and Lloyd grinned ominously. The queen held out her hand and ordered the confession spell to be performed. The man looked around in fear and asked to wait. The mages held out their hands and summoned magic circles. The hero laughed with his signature grin. Crows flew in the sky. The birds perched on the poles to which the queen's former subjects were tied. Lloyd and Xavier looked at them. The brown-haired man said that their families were innocent, so he begged for such a punishment for them. The young man smiled and muttered what a kind person he was. The knight still had that devilish grin in his eyes. The hero was just a little annoyed because they had to stop construction because of those idiots. Alicia made a hand gesture and ordered all the inhabitants of the kingdom to devote themselves to building the suspension bridge. Long live the queen. Thanks to the high-level mages who used gravity magic, they managed to reduce the weight of the blocks, so the tower was erected in an instant. The hero ordered Belle, who was holding the rope, to prepare to launch. The boy put out his hand and shouted that it was time. The snake flew forward. The inhabitants watched this spectacle. Podong was waiting for her on the other tower. The hamster caught Belle with the rope, which was immediately connected to the socket. The hero ordered to move to the second rope. Xavier watched from the crowd. Standing next to him, Julian muttered that his brother was so cool. The swordsman smiled and noted that the boy was also a good boy, since he tirelessly did hard work that he had never known about before. The knight recalled that as a child, Julian said that he wanted to learn the art of wielding a sword, but the weapon was so heavy that he almost hurt himself. The young man looked at his interlocutor in surprise. Xavier looked at the student's pumped-up arms and added that this would not be a problem for him now. Hippo lifted the platform out of the water, and the mages used the art of destruction to melt it. The hero swung his shovel and, having stuck it into the ground, shouted joyfully, "Notification! The construction of the suspension bridge in the royal capital of Magenta is complete. You have been awarded a large amount of bonus RP for your success in construction. Bonus points plus 1050. Number of RP 3019. The hero did not spend them and now he was able to save up. The boy knelt before the queen. The woman announced that the bridge would be named after Lloyd Frontera and his brave knight. It would be called Royhabi. The government also granted the boy the title of chief craftsman. Corgidus, standing in the crowd with a bottle, was surprised that such a kid had been given such a title since he had made the bridge's covering. However, the dwarf admitted that only Lloyd could have designed such a miracle. Now that they had received such a large fee for the construction, the estate's debt issue was resolved. The hero closed his eyes and thought that there was still one big obstacle left. He squinted and exchanged glances with the queen. Alicia thought that there were many more places where she could use such a talent. The boy guessed that the queen was thinking about how else to use him. But his dream was to be rich and unemployed. But he needed to act according to the plan. The woman looked at him and said that there was one more task that needed to be discussed at the palace. The hero thought there was something that would help get rid of the king's control and solve Julian's problems at the academy. Lloyd smiled and replied that he would do as he was told. He would kill two birds with one stone. Later, in the throne room of the palace, the queen stood over the hero and his knight. She announced that she would grant Lloyd Frontera lands and a title that would match his skills. The disgruntled officials flinched. The woman glanced at them and thought that the son of a baron from a village who had punished high officials like them did not need lands and a title. It would be difficult to please him. The brown-haired man bowed and thanked the ruler for her kindness. He said that he was only an insignificant person and he was sorry for dreaming of becoming someone more. The nobles glanced at him with displeasure. The red-haired woman looked at the young man intently and asked him to tell her. The boy closed his eyes and noted that it was indeed reasonable to believe that such a small man only wanted lands or titles. Alicia looked at him with interest and said that she would listen and judge him. She wondered if the boy wanted a government position in the kingdom or an increase in the construction fee. Whatever it was, the woman wanted to keep him near her. The boy bowed his head and said that he dreamed of the Royal Academy being cleaned out. The queen frowned and asked for more details. The hero reported that absurd, unreasonable, and terrible things were happening in the College of the Royal Academy Magenta. Students were divided by influence rather than by knowledge, which affected the physical and psychological health of the lower-level students. The teachers of the academy preferred not to notice this, just as they ignored the fact that the money was going into someone else's pockets. The brown-haired man closed his eyes and said that it was time to remind the students that their revelry in power, their erection of a class wall for the supposed aspirations of peace, was too different from the main goals of the educational institution. The ruler looked at her subject carefully. The officials looked at the young man in shock. Some were surprised, while others were obviously nervous and sweating. The hero asked Xavier to get evidence. The knight presented the queen with a scroll. Lloyd said that he and the guard had been investigating for the past 4 months. Academy graduates, a handyman, and even a conscientious professor who was fed up with such a system and eventually quit. They all told him everything in detail. The frightened officials turned to the queen and exclaimed that this was all a lie of a low person. Alicia looked at them menacingly and declared that all those who dared to speak now would be subject to a confession spell. The magicians surrounded the men and activated the check. After a while, these officials also began to decorate the pillars on the street. The academy was being cleaned up under the personal supervision of the queen. The woman commanded the guards, ordering them not to miss anyone and not to make any exceptions for those who were familiar with them or somehow connected. She frowned and shouted that, depending on the nature of the crime, they could fire, take away lands, and even execute. Screams and pleas for mercy were heard. The protagonist and his knight watched what was happening from the hill. The young man's face was distorted by a satisfied grin or a devilish grin, something in between. The swordsman looked at him and noted that the gentleman was glad that the academy had been cleaned up. Lloyd grinned and explained that the queen had completely forgotten about his existence. All he had to do was slip away unnoticed and live in chocolate. The knight asked him not to make such a face, even if he was in a good mood. Kale appeared behind the guy and said that there was a message from Her Highness. The knight relayed the queen's request to attend the banquet tomorrow night. The hero turned around and hesitantly agreed. The man looked at him and relayed the queen's words. It was a great idea to use the academy as a ploy to get out from under her nose. She respected his desire to play. Lloyd turned pale and thought that he was in the queen's palm. The knight turned and left. The hero watched him go and muttered that he was scared. He looked at Xavier and asked if he couldn't see the man approaching. The knight shook his head and replied that Lord Kale was the best swordsman in the kingdom. It would be very easy for him to hide his tracks from a knight of Xavier's caliber. The important guests' rooms. Julian looked at his brother in surprise and asked if he knew this would happen, which is why he allowed himself to beat Diego so badly. The hero leaned back on the back of the sofa and muttered that it wasn't that bad. He closed his eyes and said that a simple builder who received a royal order did an excellent job. They were going to reward him, so the boy wanted to deal with the academy. He had faith, justice was on his side. He knew that everything would work out. The boy looked down thoughtfully, then looked up when the interlocutor called him a punk. The student turned to his brother. The brown-haired man looked at him questioningly and asked what the punks wanted. Julian smiled and asked him not to use the word punk anymore because he was his older brother, who he could rely on, and of whom he was more proud than anyone else. The hero's eyes widened in surprise. Notification: Julian Frontera thinks of you as a hero who appeared in a time of crisis. He opened his heart to you, respects and acknowledges you. Kinship with Julian has increased by 65 points. You have earned 910 RP as a bonus. RP amount 3929. There was a pause. Lloyd grimaced and said that he was going to throw up from these words. The boy turned away and muttered that he really regretted saying that. Music was playing in the hall, and the elegant guests were chatting noisily. The queen took a glass and asked Lloyd to come to her. The hero, trying to hide behind his collar, was sweating. The woman looked at him and noted that this made him even more conspicuous because he looked like a mole cricket. The guy smiled tensely and muttered that everything was wrong. Xavier bowed and admired the ruler's farsightedness. They agreed with the queen that in front of them was a real mole cricket. The brown-haired man glanced sideways at the knight, indignant that he was so pleased. Alicia narrowed her eyes and asked if the aristocrat had not heard when she asked him to come closer. The hero quickly came up and apologized. There was a pause. The woman asked him to come closer, and the guy took a step, then another and another. The redhead approached the sweaty young man and asked him to come even closer. Their faces almost touched. Lloyd muttered that he dared not come any closer to her ladyship. The woman leaned forward and quietly told him in his ear that the guy should come to her as soon as he changed his mind. She could give him everything. Alicia passed by and added that this banquet was in his honor. The hero clenched his fist and thought that it was in the bag. Of course, it was best to live doing nothing. But what if a natural disaster happened or there were problems with the estate? The brown-haired man raised his hands and smiled, deciding that he would work and earn a living. Then he would have a luxurious pension. He pounced on the food and thought that he could not wait to get started. He was paid for the work, and now he could just have fun. The knight looked at his master with a sigh. Lloyd froze and remembered that in 3 years the story of the blackening of the queen would happen. By that time he would have both a pension and an estate. 2 men passed behind the hero and said the phrase, "The banquet will last until the moon begins to wane." The young man realized that he knew this phrase. This is the moment when the queen was poisoned and she lost her arm. A secret code that her killers shared. This phrase was supposed to sound in 3 years, and not now. Lloyd turned around and wondered why it was said by Mr. Kale. The queen leaned back on the sofa. She put her hand on her forehead and wondered if she had drunk too much. It seemed to her that everything was as usual. Alicia stood up and thought that the last few days had been oversaturated with events, the academy eliminating the consequences of the flood. She frowned and thought that there were more encroachments from the enemy country of Isfahan. She remembered Samark, an ally in Chad, and thought that he was gathering an army in the western part of Isfahan, according to spies too many for simple exercises. The queen wondered if this could be an invasion. If they were planning an invasion, they would be massing their troops at the northern borders. Attacking through the endless wasteland would be akin to suicide. The woman closed her eyes and wondered what the hell they were planning. She grabbed her head. Alicia frowned and thought it was strange. Wouldn't the mana have absorbed so much alcohol in her blood already? The queen grabbed her heart and thought she couldn't control her heartbeat. Her breathing was labored. She thought she could neutralize this rotation of mana. Her heart was beating hard. Alicia folded in half. She opened her eyes and thought it was poison. How was that possible? She carefully checked all the food. The woman stood up. She held her heart and screamed that she needed to go outside, to the street where there was no one. Her gaze swam. She was for help. Suddenly the doors opened. Alicia looked forward in shock. Lord Kale stood in front of her. The queen extended her hand and said that she was glad that he was there at the most difficult moment and asked to give her her hand. The man looked at her and said that he was really glad that he was here on time. He took out the sword and said that he would help her fall asleep forever. Alicia opened her eyes in shock. Lloyd went ahead and said that they needed to go. They were in trouble. The guys walked down the corridor. The brunette frowned and asked if he would ask what happened. Xavier replied that he also felt a strange mana energy and asked what he should do. The hero frowned and said that he had to defeat the sword master. The blue-haired man went ahead and asked, "Is this really such a joke? It is very inopportune." He replied that he needed him to stall for time. The knight ran forward. He grabbed the candelabra. They ran forward. Xavier said that he could hold out for 3 minutes. The hero replied that that was enough. The boys turned the corner. They saw the dead men. Kale swung his sword. Alicia blocked his blow. The man looked at her and said that even in such a state she blocked the blow 3 times. It was great. The woman asked why he was doing that. He hit her in the stomach. The man swung his sword. His eyes widened. Xavier hit him on the shoulder. Kale turned around. He attacked the guy. The man frowned and thought, how could he block his blow with a candlestick? Who does he think he is? The knight's eyes flashed. He summoned a blow with a higher vibration. Kale looked at him in shock. Xavier pushed him away. The man thought, what was that? This is a very unusual way of mana. The youth swung the candlestick. He struck one blow after another. Lloyd ran to the queen and asked if she was okay. Alicia looked at him in shock and asked how he knew. The guy covered her mouth and said that they would talk later. He put his hand on her stomach and thought that he would use the Azrahan method now. The hero began to absorb mana. Xavier struck the man. Kale's sword caught fire. The knight gritted his teeth and thought that this was the aura sword. Only a master could create such a sword. Once he finished the end of everything. He threw a candelabra at him. Kale parried his blow. The blue-haired man jumped for the weapon. He caught the candelabra in the air and swung to strike. The man frowned and thought that he had to admit that this young man was a genius in mana management and his skills. He struck him in the stomach and thought that, however, he lacked practical experience. Kale swung the sword. Xavier managed to jump back. The guy was falling. Lloyd gritted his teeth. He narrowed his eyes and thought that he was counting on him. If he lost, then they were all finished. Kale smiled. Xavier was falling and thought that the blow was a blank, but he still managed to wound. The man braced himself and thought that this was his best chance to attack. The guy rushed to meet him. Kale swung his sword and thought, is he really coming? Has he completely lost his fear? Xavier dodged his blow. He called Pipadong. The hamster grabbed the sword and threw it towards him. The man naturally bit his teeth. The knight pulled the sword out of its sheath. Kale ran to attack. Xavier pursed his lips. He rushed forward with a tearing blow. The man gritted his teeth. He flew back. Kale broke through the doors. He frowned and thought, is he really using a sword like a cannon? This is some kind of nonsense. A stream of fire flew towards him. The man dodged. Xavier swung his sword at him. The guy attacked him again with an explosion. Explosions occurred throughout the corridor. Kale thought what a monster he was. Lloyd gritted his teeth. He was healing the queen. She looked up at him and wondered how that was even possible. She thought he was absorbing her mana, not just hers, he was absorbing her poisoned mana. Lloyd continued to heal her and told her not to talk to him or he wouldn't be able to concentrate. Alicia frowned and asked how he dared yell at her. He replied that it couldn't be, maybe she had hearing problems because of the poison. She replied that she didn't think so. He apologized and told her to be lenient with him. The guy coughed up blood. The woman pursed her lips and wondered what he was doing. The brunette gritted his teeth. She thought, was he really willing to save her even if it killed him? Kale crashed into the door. A stream of fire flew towards him. In general, an explosion occurred in the hall. The man landed on one knee. Xavier was following him. He frowned and thought that he would never get out of here. Kale frowned and thought that he would only waste time trying to get rid of him. He smiled and thought that he was a fool. The man extended his hand to the side and asked for the guard's attention. He said that this man along with his henchmen dared to attack Her Majesty. They should raise their arms to protect the queen. The guards pointed their weapons at Xavier. They ran to attack him. The knight prepared to fight back. He gritted his teeth. The guards scattered one after another. The blue-haired man held the sword and looked at them. He swung the sword. Kale frowned and thought that he had thrown back 3 elite warriors with just one blow. In all of history, he had never heard of a man with such skills. If he reached the level of a sword master, he would be able to wield a power that would be able to easily destroy a small country. Xavier looked ahead with anger. Kale thought that this would never happen. He took out his sword, ordered the guards to disperse, and said that he would use it against him. The knight gritted his teeth and thought that it was an aura sword. The man was advancing on him. He swung his sword. The guy looked at him in shock. He moved his foot to the side. The glow of the ball blinded him. Xavier was thrown back several corridors. He was being knocked off his feet by the purple glow. Kale followed him. The knight was lying unconscious on the ground. The man was approaching him. Xavier gritted his teeth and thought that the absorption of the poison was complete. He stood up. The queen called him. The guy spewed out black liquid from himself. Alicia frowned and said that if he sat quietly like that, he would die. She looked at him and told him to concentrate all his mana in one hand. The guy gritted his teeth and thought that she was right. She needed to cut off her arm. That's exactly what she did to herself in the novel. There would be no damage from losing one arm. The only thing is that it would be awkward to swing a shovel. He grabbed the knife and extended it forward. Lloyd screamed a tearing blow. A glow appeared around the knife. It erupted a stream of energy. It broke through the roof of the building. Kale looked to the side. He frowned and thought, what was that? It looked like a powerful release of mana. What did this Lloyd do? The man turned his gaze to Xavier. He stood up unsteadily. The blonde frowned and thought how he managed to get up after a direct collision with his aura sword. Xavier looked at him and thought that he made an oath. The sword in his hands reflected. The guy extended it forward and thought that he would keep it. The moon was shining. Lloyd looked at his knight. He said that he was scared from the very beginning to the end. The hero raised his eyebrows and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking. The boy looked down and said that as a knight guarding the young master, he forgot about his duties and rushed towards the Mega Titan, and was also disappointed that the young master did not support him. He said that he wanted to trust the young master. After all, it was always like that. The blue-haired man lowered his gaze and said that with weak willpower and lack of strength. He looked at the fire and said that with neglecting his duties, he was completely unsuitable for the role of a knight. Lloyd smiled and said that everything he just said was completely wrong. He looked at him and said that despite this, he still had to take a 6-month pay cut. Xavier looked at him. The guys sat silently by the fire. The blue-haired one looked up and said 3 months. The hero asked if he really thought he would give in. He answered no. The brunette asked why ask then. The knight looked at the fire and said that he swears as the young master's companion to never neglect his duties again. The hero looked at him and asked if he really thinks he will believe him while he is just a stick in the fire. He answered that he shouldn't believe him, but he still keeps his oath. Xavier, without looking up, said that he already knows that the master has reached the level of 3 rings. He needs to catch up with him quickly if he wants to continue to be his knight, so he must become a sword master by the end of the year. Lloyd smiled and asked what kind of tone it was, as if he was saying that he was going to lose 5 kilograms by the end of the year. He replied that it was just thinking out loud. The guys sat in silence. The hero picked up a stick and told them to listen to him. He began to draw in the sand and said that each person has a limit to how much they can expand the heart of fashion. Theoretically, he will not be able to grow further even if he trains for 100 years, since it is generally possible to become a sword master. In his opinion, the boundless ocean of mana is not so easy to polish. Xavier erased his drawing. He looked at it and said that this time he will do without the help of the master. He thought that he will not rely on him anymore. Kale flew forward with his sword at the ready. Xavier ran towards him and thought that this time he will become a sword master using only his own strength. The man pierced him with a sword. Purple energy emanated from the sword. Kale frowned and said that he never ceased to amaze him. Any other body would have been shattered into pieces after meeting his aura sword. He held the sword and asked if he had strengthened his body by combining all his mana. If that were possible, he would have admired his little tricks. The man's expression darkened and said that he should die now. Xavier's body was engulfed in flames. The boy screamed. Kale looked at his hand in shock. The knight grabbed his opponent's hand. The man looked at him and said that he was crazy. What was he doing? The blue-haired man gritted his teeth and thought that the mana emitted by his aura sword was tearing him into pieces. He thought that he should let it pass through the sword. The boy held the man's hand and thought that he would pass the mana to his hand. Kale gritted his teeth. The knight thought that he would pass the mana then to his heart. The mana fire was burning. Kale lifted the guy on the sword and screamed, and threw him away. Xavier was printed into the wall. He fell. The guy was lying on the floor unconscious. The man looked at him. He came closer and thought that he could not feel his breath and the flow of mana. Kale turned away and thought that he had wasted too much time, and now it was time to go for the queen's head. Xavier said that now he understands. He stood up. The blonde turned around. The knight said that now he understands what kind of mana the master of the sword is. He raised the sword. Kale widened his eyes and thought, is this really an aura sword? He had never seen anything like it. The guy swung the sword. In his hands was a huge sword. He shot his mana. Kale gritted his teeth. He swung the sword. Xavier's mana was stronger than his. Kale dodged the blow. He frowned. His hand was cut off. It fell far from him. The man fell to the floor and screamed. The guards ran to him. They looked up. Xavier looked at them and said that who would like to meet the sword master. The woman called Lloyd. She held his hand and asked him to open his eyes. She asked if he had the ability to absorb mana, then he could absorb her mana. Alicia frowned and thought that they can't afford to lose a talented person. He must wake up. Lloyd opened his eyes. A system window appeared that he survived the deadly poison. A new skill option for the Heart of Mana was opened. A system window appeared that he is now resistant to all poisons. When the skill is activated in a state of fatigue, mana begins to be absorbed from the surrounding environment. Lloyd smiled and thought that these are really useful skills. The queen frowned. She punched the guy with her fist. He looked at her in shock. Alicia frowned. The brunette looked at her and asked why she did that. She replied that she didn't know. It was all in his face. The guy asked what was wrong with his face. Alicia looked at him and asked if he was feeling better, if he could get up on his own. The hero was lying on the floor. He said that his legs were shaking a little. He thought that he needed to hurry up and help Xavier. He thought that now that he had the skill of absorbing mana from the environment, when he was tired, he had no other choice but to test it. Lloyd began to absorb mana. 3 rings were spinning around his heart. His heart was increasingly filled with mana. He prepared for a quick, powerful fight. Alicia pulled away and screamed what was happening. Mana was entering the boy's body. The energy of objects and walls was being absorbed. Shadows began to advance. Mana was being absorbed throughout the room. The queen raised her hand and thought, what a huge absorption capacity he has. At this rate, all her mana will be depleted. She screamed at him to become. Lloyd lay with his eyes closed. The woman thought, can't he hear her? She pursed her lips and thought that he saved her life. The queen knelt down and thought that he could take her mana until his heart was full, and with this power he would help his knight. Lloyd continued to absorb mana. The woman closed her eyes. The guy raised his chin. Mana from all over the room was flowing to him. He opened his eyes wide. The queen lowered her head. A system window appeared. That yes, as the mana heart increased to the level of a minor sword specialist, he now has a new option available. For 60 seconds his berserker mode will be available, which allows you to move towards a given target. In the state mode, strength, endurance and reflexes increase by 200%. The skill is available only once a day. Lloyd's eyes widened in surprise. He stood up and thought that his body felt so weightless, as if he had been properly recharged. The boy frowned and remembered Xavier. He thought that he must be fighting the sword master one-on-one now. The hero turned and addressed the queen, suddenly screamed in surprise. He looked around and thought, what happened to her? Was she really that affected by the skill? The boy recoiled when the woman said that she would like to know more later. She frowned and said that the main thing now was to stop Kale. Would he be able to carry her? Lloyd threw his jacket over her and said that he was at her service. He thought that the queen was something special. It didn't matter what people would say after that. The boy stood up and said that they were ready. He ran down the corridor with all his might and thought that Xavier had to hold on. His master was rushing to his aid. The queen opened her eyes and thought that Xavier was truly a genius at mana manipulation. However, it was not enough to defeat the sword master Kale alone. She closed her eyes and thought that she should now save up some mana. What she was currently able to produce was only a third of her strength. Lloyd turned the corner. He saw Xavier standing in front of the army. The brunette opened his eyes and called out to him. He thought, is that really an aura sword in his hands? Kale was lying on the floor. The hero thought he had succeeded. Alicia stepped forward and told them to lay down their weapons immediately. The guards looked at her. The woman said that the only one who tried to kill the queen was Kale, and these 2 young men dared to take a risk and save her life. Lloyd scratched his head and thought that it was because she was a solvent customer. The queen pointed to the young men and told them to show them their respect and be polite to their heroes. The guards stood at attention. Alicia walked past the rows of soldiers and said that everyone who is present at the banquet today will be questioned. These are just precautions, so she asks for cooperation. The brunette looked at the knight and asked, is he really a sword master now? He answered positively. The heroes asked why he was talking about it so casually. He answered what else did he expect from him. Xavier turned away and said that from now on, more dangerous trials can await him, and this is the only way to fulfill his mission as a protector. Lloyd looked at him in shock and thought that he was insanely glad that he was okay. He smiled and said that he could say whatever he wanted. He thought that he was just glad that everything was okay. A system window appeared, that today he was able to become part of another grand event. The incredible power of his achievements allowed him to unlock hidden skills. Lloyd looked at the system window in shock and thought what kind of thing they would give him today. A system window appeared, that the reward system was being activated. The brunette looked at the notification. It said that titles were created for his achievements. Each title gives him a bonus skill. Also, every month at midnight on the full moon they give him a certain amount of title points. He thought, what kind of nonsense is this? There should be a defender of Cremo or a hero of Magentano. Why couldn't they come up with something cool? Lloyd looked at the notification, which said that the title name was invented in accordance with his image. He wondered if it was possible to change them. The hero scratched his cheek and thought that it was good that, as he says, he gets titles, he can develop a skill. A system window appeared, that the title was well done, the lobster Cremo, he gets a gift effect. The guy frowned and thought, could this be some kind of bug? Do all titles have their own effect? He thought, what are these CP points for? The system will not tell him even if he asks. A system window appeared, that he was going to tell him, but now he won't. The hero asked to tell. He is very sorry. The system window said that he should ask for more. Lloyd was kneeling. Xavier thought that he was acting strange again. A system window appeared that when he uses the collected CP points, he gains absolute powers against the laws of nature. The hero opened his eyes. After a while, Lloyd stretched. He looked at the guy and said that he was very tired. He couldn't even sleep because of these interrogations. He asked him if he found out who was in league with Kale. The hero looked down and said that no, they say they use confession spells on everyone who uttered the secret phrase. Why is it taking so long? Most likely everything is not going so smoothly. Because of all this, leaving the capital is not possible. He is stuck here for a long time. Lloyd looked away and thought that he wants to quickly resolve this issue and go home. But this attempted murder in the novel was not described in such detail. Perhaps it should have been in the second season. He thought that the event itself happened 3 years earlier than in the novel. Given this, the future may change even more. The guy pursed his lips and thought that if this continues, they will have problems. His trump of knowledge of the future will be useless. He thought that he had just received the necessary skills. A system window appeared that when he uses the collected CP points, he will gain absolute power against the laws of nature. The skill ending spoiler is available. The hero thought that he can really use this skill. The guy looked at Lloyd and asked, what about Xavier? Is he still under investigation? That Her Majesty called him for an audience because he became a sword master. The red-haired man looked at the hero. He was silent for a while. Then he exploded and asked again. Lloyd asked what is surprising here. He said that Xavier defeated Kale. Obviously, it was possible because he became a sword master. The brunette raised his eyebrows when the guy said that he thought he did it thanks to the help of the soldiers. He asked if there was any sense in his words. Even 100 soldiers would not be enough to defeat the sword master. The red-haired man smiled and told him to wait. Lloyd looked at him carefully. Alicia sat on the throne and said that thanks to this story, Xavier proved his amazing sword skills and also demonstrated a change in the shape of the aura ball, which he had never seen before. The queen looked at him and said that as far as he knew, instead of the commander of the guards, she was currently free, so she ordered him to stay by her side as the commander of the guards from now on. The guy looked down. The red-haired man looked at the hero and asked, is the knight leaving them? The blue-haired man remained silent. The queen looked at him when he apologized for his rudeness. Lloyd looked away. He grimaced and asked, does he really know Xavier that little? The boy bowed and said that this unworthy one is only a knight of Baron Arcus Frontera. He asks to understand that he cannot leave him. The queen looked at him carefully. She sat on the throne and asked if he understood what she was asking him for. The woman raised her eyebrows and said that disobeying the royal order was akin to treason. Xavier was kneeling when she asked if he knew how this could end for him. He looked down and said that his fate was in her hands. He only asked to allow him to write one farewell letter to the Baron. Alicia leaned on her hand and said that this was his way of telling her that he would rather die. How noble. The blue-haired one asked for forgiveness for the insult he had caused. The queen frowned. The knight looked down. Alicia told him to go. She respected his will. The boy bowed and thanked her. He stood up from his knees. The knight walked down the corridor. He looked forward when he was called. The boy was looking at him. He stood in front of Xavier and asked what the queen said. Xavier smiled. He looked at the redhead and said that he was forever a knight of the Frontera house. The boy smiled. Alicia sat on the throne and thought about the Frontera estate. She smiled and thought that she was not very popular with the local lord. After a while, Lloyd looked at the system window. He raised his finger and thought it was time to look at the skills he received for other achievements. The guy scrolled through the list and said that the title My Whole Body Aches he received after a skirmish with Newman. He also received the title Residents of Frontera are Blessed, and the title I Will Stretch Your Mug on an Orc allows you to use What Is This? The hero smiled and said that he also received the titles Magentano Fisherwoman, Absolute Trust in the King Eulisha, and Not a Single Suspicion of Treason in Case of a Conspiracy. Lloyd smiled and thought that he would be safe no matter how those old men tried to frame him. Many aristocrats were punished because of him. Suddenly his face changed. He thought that the full moon was shining brightly. Now he would always receive bonuses when the moon was full. A system window appeared that the full moon was lighting up the night sky. Bonus CP points from the titles he received were awarded. Lloyd stood up and thought that the points had appeared. A system window appeared that using the points he could see fragments of the future that would unfold at the end of the chapter of this story. The required CP points were 20. The hero smiled and thought that no matter how much he thought about it, in the current situation he could only see a lousy future. Wouldn't it be sad if he gained weight by overeating candy? He pressed the yes button to use this skill. Suddenly, darkness formed around him. The guy smiled nervously and asked what it was. He was kind of scared. He started calling Mr. Message. Suddenly a wall of fire appeared nearby. Lloyd turned around and wondered where he was. There was a city around him. He thought he knew this city. The hero turned around and thought it was the Frontera estate. He thought why the houses and trees looked so strange. The guy frowned. He looked at the body. The brunette turned around and thought what it was. There were many bodies around him. He thought what kind of ending was this? Lloyd frowned and shouted if there was anyone here. He asked to answer him. The guy ran forward and turned to the message. He asked, is this all real? Is this all really happening? The hero looked forward in shock. Xavier was standing in front of him. The brunette opened his eyes in shock. He saw his parents. The man stood in front of him. He said that if only he had passed earlier. His future self was crying. He said that he was so sorry. He apologized for not being able to protect them. The hero gritted his teeth. He raised his head and screamed, why did it have to end like this? The boy turned around. A black flock was flying towards the city. They were flying insects. The locusts were approaching. Lloyd frowned. The boy took a step forward. Xavier walked past the hero. He pulled out his sword from its sheath. The blue-haired man swung his sword. His mana cut through the cloud of insects. The boy ran forward. He struck again. The knight screamed. He struck a third time. The locusts scattered. Lloyd looked ahead and thought, did they really succeed? The locusts were approaching them. The swarm was flying towards the knight. He was surrounded. The hero woke up in reality. He was sitting on his knees in shock. His face dripping with sweat, he turned to the system and asked if this would really happen. A system window appeared, saying, even after seeing all this, he still doesn't believe it. Lloyd stood up from his knees. He ran forward. The guy ran down the hallway and thought that he clearly said that this would happen in the future. He remembered how his future self said if only he had come a little earlier. The hero ran forward and thought that he didn't know how, but they had to deal with this. The incident with the locust invasion was familiar to him. Alicia raised her head and asked, would the entire Cremona region really suffer? Lloyd knelt before her and said that it was true. They needed to mobilize the army to be ready for any situation. The queen replied that it was unexpected and he should tell her more about this disaster. The guy frowned and said that this was the work of the enemy Asfahan. Their main goal was to weaken the power of the Magenta Kingdom by creating the so-called domino monsters. He knelt before the queen and said that by subjugating the monsters of the eastern wasteland, they were depriving them of their natural habitat. Another group of monsters would be pushed westward, and with the other monsters that came, the creatures would push each other like dominoes, causing irreparable damage to the western territories. The hero frowned and thought that in the novel, this would happen in 3.5 years, and not even on their lands. It should happen further north. He does not know why the time and details have changed so much, but now is not the time to think about it. Alicia looked away and thought that Asfahan must have really made some encroachments in the western wastelands. It is definitely possible, however. The woman looked at Lloyd and turned to him. She raised her chin and said that this news about Asfahan raises doubts. How does he know this? The guy tensed up and thought that he urgently needed to come up with an answer. The queen said that if you think about it, he was hiding a lot from her. She frowned and said that even Asfahan's actions were less suspicious than his behavior. Lloyd licked his lips. He bowed and said that thanks to small connections, kinship with the tribe of steel sand orcs from the wasteland, they told him what was happening throughout the west. He knelt and said that before anyone else, he learned about Kale's attempt to kill her. He and the chief chamberlain exchanged strange phrases and kept a close eye on each other. At first he thought they were dating and purely for fun followed them and caught them red-handed. The guy closed his eyes and said that what allowed him to absorb mana and make the surrounding environment viscous. She also knows about his Knight Protector. a genius the world has never seen. Alicia looked at him suspiciously when he said that he had been with him since he was a baby and trying to protect himself learned various techniques from him. He was also a genius of sorts, that's why he succeeded in this so much. She thought that almost all of this made sense. The queen frowned and thought that he was making this story up as he went along. The guy thought that she seemed to sense some improvisation. The woman was silent. The guy waited tensely for her answer. A system window appeared, that the reward effect was activated, the queen's absolute trust, not a single suspicion of treason in the event of a conspiracy. Lloyd opened his eyes in shock. Alicia closed her eyes and agreed. She said to immediately allocate fighters, 500 white spearmen, and she gives him 50 magicians for support, transfers command into his hands, since he knows the enemy's movements. Lloyd smiled predatorily and thought that she was too generous. He thanked her for the favor. The queen leaned back in her chair and said, he knows better than anyone that this is no favor. Does he really think that she will ask for nothing for believing in unfounded conjectures? He replied that he knows that nothing is done so easily in this world. He smiled and said that if this helps to stop the attack of the monsters, then she should know that all the predictions of the solution are in the power of Her Majesty, and he will do everything possible to restore the authority of the royal family by solving this problem. Alicia smiled and said that he was driving suspiciously, but she liked the way he spoke. Lloyd and Xavier saddled their horses. They rode forward. The hero's face fluttered in the wind. His knight said that there must be an explanation for why he was doing this, but could he go slower? The guy galloped forward. He said something unintelligible. Xavier said that he understood everything and he could share it with him. The horses galloped at the speed of sound. Lloyd said something unintelligible, and Xavier translated it as that first they needed to get to the estate in 5 days. The brunette flew forward and thought that now his knight could defeat the entire army of the small country. See how a dozen people are cut down with one sword. The moral qualities of their enemy will be broken. This time their enemy is not even a person, so there will be nothing to break. They only know how to run towards the prey. The hero remembered the locusts and thought that they are not familiar with the fear of death, so one Xavier will not be enough. He thought that besides, when fire attacks are coming at you from all sides, 1 or 2 people of the power of fire cannot stop this. Lloyd looked at Peapodong. He should split up here. He asked him to show up on time. The beast jumped aside. The guy smiled and said they had a plan, so his money vein, the frontier estate, should hold out. They jumped off the cliff. After a while, the guys galloped forward. The hero stopped his horse. He looked ahead tensely. A cloud of locusts was gathering over the mountains. Lloyd frowned and thought that there was only a little time left. The people looked up in surprise. A swarm of locusts was approaching them. The guy looked up and asked what was that. Lloyd galloped up and screamed, have they gone crazy? They need to get out of here right now. He held out his hand and said to give him the biggest pot. The locusts flew forward. They were approaching the building. The window exploded next to the woman. The monster appeared in front of her. She looked at it in shock and screamed, what was it? Emily closed her eyes and screamed. The woman picked up a chair and swatted a beetle with it. More locusts burst into the building. Marbella took the girl by the hand and shouted for her to run after her. She looked out the window. A large cloud of locusts was approaching the estate. The woman darkened and thought about what was going on. Arcus ran into the room and shouted to his wife if she was okay. He frowned and told her to wait. They opened the doors to the street. There, the locusts surrounded the house. They looked at the people. Baron ran forward. He ran and shouted for the soldiers to gather at the Baron's house immediately. The man frowned. He heard someone scream. The guy was being attacked by monsters. Baron looked at him and thought that the villagers were in danger, but they needed to protect the Baron. He remembered the Baron saying he hoped that this fate would pass them by. But if trouble came to their lands, first of all, he must take care of the inhabitants. He believed that the lords and his knights exist for the sake of the common people. The man gritted his teeth. He cut off the head of the locust. The knight killed another monster. He covered the boy and told him to hold on to him. There were many insects around them. The orc cut down several monsters with one blow. Herach, the renowned warrior, shouted to the orcs that even if today was their last day, they must keep their promises to their brother and family. The orcs protected the hero's parents. Bayern and Mihail destroyed the monsters. The orcs tore them apart with their bare hands. The knight covered the child with his body. The woman sat on the floor. The other citizens were also attacked by locusts. Herach was bitten by the monster. Another orc protected the woman. The people and orcs fought back as best they could. The monsters kept coming. The woman was holding a baby in her arms. She looked to the side. The locusts were biting the baby's hair. Suddenly the monster let go. All the insects were looking in one direction. A light appeared inside the swarm. All the monsters flew at him. The hero screamed that they were damn insects that eat grass. Xavier was slashing with his sword. Lloyd was holding a shield. He looked to the side and screamed if they heard that. They were probably already salivating over that delicious sound. The knight gritted his teeth. He hit the shield again. All the monsters were flying at them. The locust's eyes were glowing. They formed a single line. The insects were flying at the hero. Arcus and Marbella were watching this. The Baron looked ahead and said that he knew that voice. His wife confirmed that it was definitely their son's voice. Xavier and Lloyd were jumping forward. The brunette said that they were approaching in a very frightening way. The knight looked back and said that they were following them. Everything was as they planned. Lloyd frowned and said that was great. They should gather a little more and then lure them to the outskirts. The guys galloped forward. Xavier swung, his friend said to be stronger now. He was distorted by the force of the blow. The hero looked at him and shouted that this was too much. Why was he smiling like that? He replied that he needed to hit again. Lloyd thought that everything was happening as it was said in the novel. Insects react to such loud sounds. He closed his eyes and thought that this really works. The hero looked ahead and said that now they should gallop to the Raccoon estate. Xavier frowned and thought, is he really going to help them even in such a critical situation? A system window appeared that Xavier's sympathy for him increased by 3 points. He was awarded 54 PR. Lloyd frowned and thought that he would not be satisfied with the only bill for water. Raccoon estate. The Viscount ran away and shouted, what was that? He looked away. Lloyd and Xavier ran into his estate. The old man looked at the rescuers and recognized Lloyd. He looked at him darkly and told him not to even think that he would give him a deferment on payment. The Viscount was terribly scared. The hero took out a shield and shouted forward. The Viscount watched them go. The locusts left the Raccoon estate. Xavier looked at the guy and said that it was such a tactic to herd them together, passing through the building. The hero laughed like a madman and said that it was not a tactic. He would still take it out on them. He would blow their minds. The blue-haired man looked at him in shock and thought he was crazy. Lloyd was leading a swarm and shouting, how could they do that? Would they be able to keep up with him? He frowned and said that now they would meet another Lloyd. Xavier looked at him and asked him to save his strength. There would be no point in shouting. He asked if he really didn't understand anything at all. The hero turned out to be a crazy demon again and said that in order to save them, they needed to shout in order to blow their minds in the future. The blue-haired man looked at him in shock and thought he was crazy. The guys ran from the monsters. The brunette said that this was enough and now they should gallop to their Merez swamps. Lloyd looked ahead in shock. There was a cloud of monsters in front of them. He said that there were even more of them. The knight ran forward and told him to cover himself with his load and follow him. He took out his sword, and he cut the locusts one by one. Lloyd took cover from the corpses. Xavier cut a path for them. The locusts flew into the sky. The boys galloped forward. Lloyd said that they were all together now. They ran across the field. The hero said that there was very little left. The horse was running with its last strength. Lloyd looked at it and wondered if it was already dying. The brunette frowned and told the knight to prepare his back. The hero jumped on his horse and hugged his comrade. The boy frowned and said that now he was a horse and must run. Xavier jumped off his horse. He landed on the ground. Lloyd looked ahead and spurred him. The blue-haired man galloped forward. He ran even faster than the horse, but the locusts were catching up with them. Xavier gritted his teeth. Lloyd called Belle and Hippo. The animals appeared from the river. The boys disappeared into the stream. Belle swung her tail. She turned to the swarm, and she spewed fire at them. The locusts burned. The entire swarm burned instantly. The people watched this fight. Lloyd frowned and said that it was time for the second wave. Hippo ejected water from himself. The monsters were washed away. The beast destroyed half of the swarm. The monsters fell to the ground. The hero frowned and said that it was time for the third wave. Xavier rushed forward. The boys combined their forces. They destroyed the rest of the monsters. They all fell to the ground. Lloyd crouched on the ground and breathed heavily. He fell back on the ground and said that he was going to die now. Xavier said that he was sure that they dealt with most of them. He continued that there were still a lot of them, more than several thousand. The hero smiled and said that it was okay. The hamster ran to them. He plopped down next to them. Lloyd said that their time had come. Padong brought 300 elite warriors of the Steel Sand tribe. The horses stopped. 500 white warriors and 50 mages arrived. The brunette closed his eyes and said that they should let them handle this. They had other things to worry about. The knight asked what they were. He looked at the hero when he said that they had to deal with the domino of monsters. Lloyd frowned and said that it wouldn't end in one wave. The knight raised his horse and addressed the warriors. Frowning, he shouted, saying that for the safety of Her Highness's territory, they must get rid of them. The mages charged the knight's swords. Then they rushed to the attack. Many warriors began to attack the lying insects. The orc, holding a stake in his hands, shouted loudly. He plunged it into the bodies of several creatures. After a while, the orcs roasted their meat over a fire, joyfully exulting. One of them bit off the cooked flesh. The entire tribe raised their hands, noting that they now had protein. One orc turned around when a girl approached him and called him. In her hand she clutched a small flower. The guy looked at him with surprised eyes when she began to thank him for covering her. He looked after her. A blush appeared on his cheeks. The brown-haired man sat on the ground, hearing the loud screams of his parents. The father grabbed him by the shoulders, asking if he had been there earlier and if something hurt. He answered that he was fine. The parents began to hug him, and the man said that he was sorry, but at the same time he was so grateful because he saved everyone on this miserable father's land. The woman began to ask why he liked to sacrifice himself so much and asked what they would do if he got hurt. Sweat appeared on the protagonist's tired face when he mentally noted that everything was not like that at all and that he worked like that for his sweet pension and all purely for his own benefit. When the administrator laughed, he indignantly asked why he was laughing. The administrator said that it seemed that he did not remember at all what he said at the end of the final spoiler. The guy mentally asked what he said there anyway. While he was still sitting with his parents, the administrator suggested forgetting about it. He did not remember anything anyway. The protagonist mentally noted that he didn't care anymore because from now on they had even more work to do and they needed to prepare for the second wave. The system noted that he had received a new title, Insect Bounty Hunter number 1. His coverage area was the Frontera estate and the Lacona estate. The duration was 110 years, and the CP accrual for the title was 2. The effects of the title were that just looking at an insectoid monster would instill fear in him, and under the monsters area, they would immediately become weak and lose their fighting strength. At night, Lloyd was standing outside with a shovel. He turned around when someone approached him. In front of him stood the commander of the White Knights, Belati Blank, and asked why he was called. The guy bowed to him and thanked him for responding to his request, and then thanked him for helping him fight the locusts. He raised his head when the blonde asked him to stop beating around the bush because everyone knew perfectly well who played the main role in this story. The brown-haired man told him not to take it to heart because it was a purge, and if they tried to cope with it on their own, it would have taken weeks, but thanks to the help, they only needed a day. The protagonist's eyes widened when he told him that, to be honest, at first he was very angry, and although he was a simple engineer, he received the right to control the White Warriors. The knight frowned, saying that however, having arrived here, he realized that their arrival time and location were carefully calculated. He noted that Lloyd was an outstanding strategist, and saving the queen was also not a simple coincidence. Looking at the puzzled face opposite, Blank added that all this, it hurt his pride, the magicians were released, and they are all here for him, for whom it would be an honor to die by order of the queen. He said that he does not like the guy. His face darkened. Standing in front of him, the man noted that he had said everything, and now it was his turn, and then asked what he wanted. The brown-haired man mentally noted that everything was as he thought, and that this guy turned out to be crazy. Remembering the battle from the novel, he noted that there, at the behest of the Mad Queen, this commander staged a real massacre and met in a deadly duel with Xavier, who was trying to save people. The white-haired man barely defeated him, because then he had not yet given the master of the sword. Lying with an open wound on his chest, the knight noted that it would be better to die by his hand, and then asked to fulfill his last request. Looking with a thoughtful look, he asked to stop the queen. Studying Blank's face, the protagonist mentally noted that he was a natural-born straightforward warrior who immediately got to the point. He smiled slyly, thinking that he would not be deceived, so there was only one option. Lloyd threw his shovel over his shoulder and asked if he wanted to fight him. He said that if he won, he would join their construction troops, and if he won, he could immediately return to his kingdom. There was confusion in the man's eyes. He turned away and laughed, saying that he had seen through him because he could not refuse the offer, and then asked if he had planned this from the beginning. Frowning, the man said that, however, he had missed something. He asked if he really thought that he, the queen's support and stitches, would fight a civilian without a command. The guy rested his chin on his shovel, sarcastically noting that he had overlooked something. He said that the queen had entrusted him with command of the White Warriors, so this was not a request, but an order. The knight clenched his teeth in anger. The brown-haired man said with a sly expression that even if it was an order, simply waving a shovel could cast a shadow on the knight's honor, and then asked if it would be an honor for him to win in a wild duel. Blank reached for the sword on his chest and asked if he had a weapon. The protagonist picked up his shovel. Starting to approach him, the blonde noted that he heard that he punished traitors with this shovel, but for him in any case, it does not matter. At that moment, Lloyd mentally noted that he swallowed his bait, and now his chances of winning are 0. Imagining the blue sphere, he thought about the fact that he has triple rings, but their power is laughable, and he is a genius with a sword and almost finished off Xavier, and therefore he will never cope with him. Throwing the shovel over his shoulder, the guy mentally noted that however, as always, he has a powerful trump card. Looking at him, the blonde said that since this was a duel between a knight and a commoner, the rules needed to be changed. Frowning, he said that if at least one attack from the brown-haired man made him move, he would win. A devilish smile appeared on the protagonist's face as he agreed to the terms. The knight perplexedly perked up. Lloyd decided to strike him 3 times. A powerful stream of fire forced the knight to jump aside. The fire continued. A moment later, he crashed into the top of a cliff. Blank covered his head with shock on his face. he saw a large hole on the top of the cliff. Trembling with fear, he turned around. The guy was lying powerlessly on the ground. He began to laugh wickedly. Thus, 500 enemies from the most elite unit of the Royal Road were retrained as builders of the frontier. The man angrily threw down the shovel. He approached his commander and exclaimed that no matter how much trust and power he had, such behavior was unacceptable. He loudly asked why they were digging up a battlefield where they were supposed to give their lives. Blank sighed heavily and replied that it was not just an order. He remembered the smug face of the brown-haired man who told him that swinging a shovel could be more kidney-like than swinging a sword. The commander stuck the shovel into the ground. After putting in some effort, he said that he wanted to test something, so he hoped for their support. Meanwhile, Lloyd and Xavier were standing on top of the mountain. Looking at the master, the warrior asked if this would really work. He responded by telling him that the orcs from the wasteland taught him this, so he was sure it would work. Smiling, he said that they just needed to wait. Looking at the workers on the mountainside, the brown-haired man noted that this would protect his gold mine. A monster's face made of stone began to appear on the mountain. Among the dense greenery, rare houses were visible. Inside one of them stood a large wooden mug. The table beneath it shook. A candlestick fell to the floor with a loud thud. 3 members of a family hugged each other in fear. A herd of monsters ran along the street. A local resident leaned his hands on the table. The other 2 men tried to support each other. A woman hugged a baby. It was noted that all the villagers were scared, but at the same time, many had one thought in their heads. The guy stepped on his foot. Among the trees, he saw a cloud of dust. Holding one phalanx, the brown-haired man threw the other over his shoulder. All those people hoped that he would save them. The warriors on horseback also saw a wall of dust. Blank frowned, thinking that at first he had doubts, but everything happened as he said. A herd of monsters ran through the forest. Trees broke under their hooves. Sitting at the table in front of the main character, he had previously asked if he had proof that there would be mastodons this time. Lloyd asked what he meant by proof. Opening his mouth in surprise, he asked in an iron mask, "Is it really not obvious?" The man pursed his lips, thinking that he was sure he had succeeded in the art of lying, but all his words came true. Putting the helmet on his head, he mentally noted that it would be better to prepare for battle rather than hesitate any longer. Imagining the battle scheme, the blonde thought that moving at the speed of their onslaught, they would deal with those at the head of the column. Then he decided that when they slowed down, they would immediately surround them and begin to attack. The man at the head of the military detachment thought that they could lose a maximum of 20 paumen. As he moved forward, the knight behind him said that as soon as this battle was over, he would go to his hometown and propose to his girlfriend. Another indignantly asked what kind of talk he was having. Imagining the bloody weapons, Blank thought that instead of an engagement ring, his girlfriend would only receive a spear that remained in his glory. He told himself that he should leave fear behind, because the lives of their cavalry depended on their determination. The man on horseback addressed the white warriors, telling them to prepare for an attack, but someone stopped him. He saw a man to his right. Bayern was looking at him, and the blonde asked him what he was doing here without his gear. Approaching the knight, the brown-haired man noted that the young gentleman said that he would not need it. Blank, was there something preceding this? The man said that he could not explain, but there must be a good reason for all this. The knight frowned when Bayern told him that he was here to move the signals for them. He wondered what they were talking about. The protagonist was standing on the top of the mountain, and the man asked if he could see him. The knight answered in the affirmative. The brown-haired man noted that the young gentleman would soon give a signal. Suddenly, Lloyd began waving 2 flags. Bayern, covering his eyes from the light, addressed the warriors. Seeing how the guy was waving blue flags, he said that they should move to the south of the village vice-chairman. And when he raised a blue and white flag, the man added that they should be faster. Blank looked at him and asked what kind of nonsense this was, noting that it was the same as opening a direct path to the village for the monsters. Imagining their current location relative to the village, the blonde said that it was a matter of time before they could break through the barrier. Then, imagining them in a different place, he indignantly asked him if he really thought that an attack from the side would work, and then shouted that of course it wouldn't. The protagonist began to twirl 2 flags, and the brown-haired man told them to repeat after him. Lloyd raised a white flag. When he waved it to the side, the man translated, telling them to move for the queen. Looking at Bayern, Blank loudly asked what just happened. The brown-haired man told him that everything was originally planned. Lloyd, with fury in his eyes, continued to wave the flags, mentally asking what they were thinking, and then exclaimed that there was no point in this. Meanwhile, the mastodons were approaching. The guy abruptly turned around. "I'll fly 2 flags up," he mentally shouted that they were already advancing. The monsters raced through the forest. They ran past the mountain where the brown-haired man was. He smiled slyly, thinking that the first step had been taken. The beasts still did not stop. They were heading straight for the figure of a large monster in the rock. Suddenly they slowed down. The mastodons began to fall, and the protagonist mentally answered that their sworn enemy, Megalania, stood on their own. The beasts began to crush each other, and Lloyd realized that the second step had been taken. He waved a white flag. At that moment, Bayern waved his hand and told the warriors to trot their horses. The horses began to move their hooves under the man's words that they should raise as much dust as possible. Then the men scraped their copies. Blank frowned, thinking that although he was following the instructions, he did not understand at all what he was doing. The mastodon stomped on the ground. The rest ran away from the megalania. Pursing his lips, the brown-haired man mentally noted that they were afraid of the megalania, and the horse axe made them think that even more lizards were moving here. The animals tried to figure out where to run. The protagonist realized that they would then move south. Frowning, the knight thought that they were moving. He wondered if this was the direction of the trenches that his soldiers had previously dug when they carved the lizard on the rock. Remembering how many men dug a trench, the blonde thought that back then he wondered why they were digging so much. The mastodons ran straight there, and Lloyd noted that this was the third step of his plan. The animals began to fall into the trench. A white flag appeared in the air. A giant hippo appeared in front of the pit. The guy frowned and shouted, telling him to pour water. A moment later, water poured out of the animal's mouth. The mastodons began to sink and howled loudly. The brown-haired man threw out the flags. He spread his arms in different directions. Blank, Bayern, and the knights watched him, after which a loud cry was heard that they had won. Under a loud cry, the wave washed away the mastodons. After a while, they began to get out onto dry land. Blank watched them from the hill. Nervously opening his mouth, he mentally noted that they really had won without even starting to fight. A guy squatted down next to him and noted that there was enough food for them here and they did not have to go back to where the megalania was, and plus he was glad that they now had this channel. The blonde frowned and asked if the creation of this channel was part of the plan. The brown-haired man smiled slightly and replied that he would not call it a plan, because he just thought that since they were digging a trench, it could be used. The man pursed his lips. He mentally noted that they had lost 5 warriors during this battle. In front of him was a crying woman with a child. A knight was kneeling in front of her with a bloody weapon. The commander behind him said that he had fought with honor for the kingdom and its subjects. Looking at him with a darkened look, the blonde said that their soldiers in the kingdom of Magentana would always remember the knight Durando's brew. The woman fell to her knees. She bent over her husband's bloody weapon. After a while, Durando and the others were buried. Looking at the graves, their comrades cried. Turning around abruptly, Blank rudely asked how much longer they were going to waste time here and then sent them off to train. Then night fell. The man was kneeling in the rain in front of the cemetery of his former comrades. His face was emotionless. Staring ahead with empty eyes, he thought of courage and honor, mentally noting that these were the words he repeated to himself when he lost his warriors, but it was all nonsense. Trembling and hanging his head, Blank thought that deep down he already knew that death leaves behind far from honor. Remembering the grief-stricken widow, he thought that after death only hell awaits. The warriors raised their weapons. Embracing his comrade, the knight exclaimed that he must definitely invite them to his wedding. The blonde watched the joy of his comrades. Behind him stood Lloyd with Xavier, who asked the master if his words were true, that they would never stop. The brown-haired man answered that they would stop someday, but before that, at least a few more such attacks awaited them. He pointed to his head when the blonde man said that each such attack could cause great damage to the estate, and so they should do something to stop them. The protagonist noted that his IQ had increased. He smirked smugly and asked to guess what he was doing now. Xavier opened his mouth and said that it was obvious that they would attack the monsters with as little effort as possible. When Lloyd asked him what the plan was, he replied that he was sure he had it in his head. The guy glanced back when Blank said that his warriors would help implement it. He asked him if they were going to return to the capital. The knight replied that he was thinking about writing a letter to the queen asking her to stay. He frowned and said that today he saw what a real victory was, and at the same time realized what an inept commander he had been. The man waved his hand. He knelt down on one knee. Bowing his head to the surprised guys, he asked to let him observe his wisdom for a little while longer. The knights behind him also knelt down. The brown-haired man opened his mouth, falling silent. The blonde looked up when he told him to try not to be too surprised and not to jump out of his pants with happiness. The protagonist smiled and noted that this would seem impossible even for the White Warriors, because this time they would be making a legend come true. After a while, all of them in the Frontier family found themselves at the same table. Lloyd looked at his father and asked if he remembered when he proposed to build a waterway from Lake Capua. He was categorically against his idea. The man replied that he remembered that. Introducing a huge monster with many paws, the guy added that this was because according to legends, a monster called the Royal Storm lives on Lake Capua. Arcus folded his arms and said that, however, to make them agree with his idea, he assured them that he would not disturb the monster for any reason. Brown-haired replied that it was true, but he did plan to wake it. His father froze. Gloomy and frowning, he asked indignantly. Marbella, sweating, exclaimed that she was absolutely against it. Blank closed his eyes and raised his palm, saying that he agreed. The man looked at the blonde man and said that as a knight, his son should not agree with him. He apologized and replied that he could not do anything. At this point, the protagonist noted that his IQ had really increased. He raised his fists high and exclaimed that through democracy they had approved a new plan, and Arcus asked him to wait. Before time, Lloyd, Xavier, and Blank, along with the knights, walked with shovels. The blonde man looked at the gentleman and asked if he wanted to wake up the beast in order to control it. The guy replied that he was not a wizard and then asked how he thought this was possible. Remembering himself in the library, he said that he had read many stories and learned a lot about the habits and plantings of the royal storm. Introducing the giant storm, the brown-haired man began to tell that in one of the stories he learned that it was described as a magical creature of incredibly huge size. But what was surprising was that he did not find a single record of it attacking people. He added that the monster made its nest on this lake, and if they destroyed it, it would simply growl at them and then start rebuilding the dwelling. To the crazy smile on his face, the main character said that in other words, they were going to destroy part of the lake. He noted that constantly, day and night, they would destroy his house every time he rebuilt it. Imagining the monster on the mountain around the lake, Lloyd added that the monsters crossing the eastern mountain would be scared by its roar, and then noted that this time the operation would be codenamed Dog in the Backyard. Xavier, looking askance at the gentleman, mentally noted that this was a plan where it would disturb the peace of the sleeping beast. He thought that even the devil himself on the sink would decide. The guy looked at him when he asked what would happen if the plan got out of control and what if the beast still broke on them. He asked why he asked him such obvious questions. The brown-haired man grimaced and pointed at his comrade, saying that since he was his knight, he would go and deal with him himself, and then scare away the monsters with his roar instead of him. He imagined the guy on the mountain, who was screaming loudly, scaring the monsters. The protagonist said that everything would be according to the strategy Dog in the Backyard. Xavier pursed his lips, wondering if he really wanted to say that he was a dog. After a while, they all looked at the island in the center of the lake. Lloyd sighed. His eyes lit up when he activated change. Starting to move his hands over the holographic map, he opened the simulation mode, and then wondered where they should now better hit to avoid the flood. The guy mentally asked if this would wake up the monster. He began to move his hands quickly. Looking at the knight, Xavier said that it might look a little strange, but he was not crazy, if only a little, so you can just ignore him. The blonde clenched his fist, saying that madness coupled with wisdom gives an extraordinary result. Someone was looking at the people on land, noting that they were back again. Air bubbles began to rise up. The monster thought that he forgave them last time, but if they disturbed his sleep again, he would strike them all to the last one. Underwater, the purple eyes of the royal storm lit up. The bright sun sparkled in the net. The guy with a dissatisfied face listened to loud laughter. Bayern lay on the ground, painted with small animals, and laughed. Suddenly his face darkened. The brown-haired man looked at him with dissatisfaction. The man rose to his feet and noted that he should have told them something. While the cubs were rubbing against his legs, he explained that they had been separated from their mother during the invasion, and he was calling to ask him for permission to keep them. Rubbing his cheek, the protagonist noted with a puzzled face that if he remembered correctly, they would become wild as they got older, and it could be a little dangerous in the future. When Bayern said that it wouldn't happen, he asked him why he was so sure about it. The man's face blushed as he said that they were too adorable. Lloyd narrowed his eyes in displeasure. Putting his hand on the back of his head, he thought that raising wild animals was not that easy, and it was difficult and tiring, and then asked if he was right. The man again said that it wouldn't happen, and the brown-haired man asked him again why he was so sure about it. With a blush on his cheeks, Bayern said that they were too adorable. The protagonist's face darkened again. As he started to leave and told him to do whatever he wanted, the man fell to the ground again and started hugging the cubs. Walking with a dissatisfied expression, the protagonist mentally noted that if this was Bayern, then he was sure that he would not let him down, and if these babies could be tamed, they could become an additional force in the future. He thought that considering that Operation Backyard Dog would be a 100% success, it would be nice to have such a strong ally. Remembering Akuch sitting on horseback, who said that monsters could attack their village, so they needed to go back to protect the people. The protagonist mentally noted that he had lost one of his strongest allies, so the situation could not be worse. But he could not change anything. He looked at the man with the brushwood and told him to send 5 volunteers to help the Steel Sand tribe and let them report on the situation on the spot as soon as possible. Greg replied that the poncho was in order. Lloyd thought that they had always been of great help to them, so he would try to make their strength and power stronger than before and today. Blank came up to him and said that everything was ready. It was the day the operation began. The guy grinned. Frowning, he shouted, saying that today they would wake up the legendary monster from sleep and that no one could do this. He pointed his finger, loudly asked who else would be able to resolve and dig up the mountain with their superpowers. The brown-haired man spread his arms out to the sides, and the knights began to rejoice, answering that it was they, the White Warriors. The protagonist put his hand to his ear and asked who could defeat him with their shovels when the monster bared his teeth. He spread his arms again, and the men answered that it was the White Warriors. Clasping his hands in a lock and raising them, his face asked if they believed in the power of a shovel. The warriors did the same and loudly answered that they believed. Raising their shovels, they followed the volley leader, shouting that the shovel was a hero and that the enemy would not pass. Xavier stood at the very end of the line and said nothing. His face darkened, and the system noted that he sympathized with the White Warriors. While the men dug up the mountain, the brown-haired man noted that with the help of the stimulation mode, he found a way to avoid the flood, and now it was necessary to create conditions that would lead to a rift in the soil. He waved to the blonde man at the top of the mountain when he shouted that he was ready. The protagonist asked him if he saw the marks he had left for him. The knight replied that he saw them. Frowning, Lloyd waved his hand, giving a sign. He thought that even when they reached the desired level, the knight plunged his sword into the ground. An explosion followed. The trees shook for a long time. Then they began to break. Thick smoke could be seen from the lake in the distance. The guy thought that it seemed that they would not be able to cause any visible damage now, but it would be enough to destroy the dam. He and the knights lay down on the ground. The water on the lake was calm. After a few moments, it began to sway. The brown-haired man thought that very soon the royal storm would wake up from its sleep. Suddenly, the island in the middle was thrown up. Covering his head, the main character raised his frightened eyes. Huge eyes were visible under the water. Xavier, meanwhile, was hiding behind a tree. Blank, along with the others, was lying on the ground. The monster began to rise from the water. The giant beaver raised its paws and growled. Lloyd narrowed his eyes in confusion. The knights opened their mouths in shock. The blonde did the same, thinking that this was. Looking at the beaver, he thought it was just cute. The boy gritted his teeth, thinking that from the tone of his growl, he could sense that it meant something like he was angry. As he watched the beaver, he thought about how stylishly it reminded him of Peapodon, Hippo, and Belle, and that he didn't understand what they were saying either. He wondered if it was some kind of mystical creature. Frowning, the brown-haired boy thought that it wasn't a problem then, and if it was a real beaver, then he was pretty sure that his top priority would be to rebuild his home. The beaver turned its gaze to him. Then it turned around. Glaring at the protagonist, it muttered. The protagonist pressed himself to the ground, realizing that the beast was asking if they really thought he wouldn't notice them. The beaver muttered again, displeased. Lloyd's horrified face began to sweat as he realized the beast had said that it looked like they were trying to pull off something by destroying his dam, and then asked if they thought he would just rebuild it and go to sleep. He asked if they could do it again if he reposted their oxygen supply. The boy mentally noted that he had been too clever and their operation had been a complete failure. Blank crawled up to him and asked what they should do now. Seeing the purple face of the gentleman, he loudly asked what happened to him. The beaver climbed into the water with his front paws. Splashing on the people, he screamed loudly. Suddenly, a wave opened up the people. The quartet suddenly jumped through it. He swung his weapon. Lunging, he directed a stream of fire at the beast. It swung its paw, redirecting it into the water. The guy's sword glowed when he thought he had no other choice. He swung again. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the main character ran out and screamed loudly, telling him to stop and saying that he had an idea. The blonde perked up. Lloyd frowned, thinking that this was a miracle of some kind of mystical creature, then this would definitely work. The beaver swung his paw at Xavier. He swung his sword, using an explosion. Then the fire threw him aside. He ended up near the head of the beast. The beaver waved its paws, trying to catch him. Meanwhile, the brown-haired one was sneaking up on him through the water. Having immersed half of his face, he mentally praised the knight, telling him to continue to distract attention. Suddenly, the beast turned around. At that moment, the guy abruptly dived under the water. Covering his mouth with his hand, he thought that he simply had excellent intuition, and it would be very difficult to get close to him. Meanwhile, the blonde-haired one directed an explosion at the enemy. The beaver blocked it with his tail. The guy swung his sword. The beast blocked the wave of green light with water. The blonde-haired one landed on the ground and cursed. Looking at the enemy's back, he thought that he would not distract him with restrained attacks, but if he hit with full force, he could seriously injure him. The knight tried to figure out what to do. Meanwhile, the main character was still hiding under the water. Xavier clenched his teeth tightly. Suddenly, he screamed loudly. The knights opened their mouths in confusion. The brown-haired man frowned underwater. The knight's scream flew in different directions. The beaver looked back sadly. Bringing his eyebrows together, he asked in a trembling voice why he called him Mom, because it was not so, especially since he was a boy. The blonde man pointed his sword at him and screamed again. The beast stretched out his paws to him and asked how he became his mom, and then asked why he was saying such strange things. Frowning, the guy screamed again. This time the beaver shook with anger, loudly asking if he really called him scary. At that moment, the main character found himself on his head. Feeling him, the beast asked what he was doing there. Pulling his paws to his head, he screamed. He also froze, and Lloyd mentally noted that he could not reach him because his paws were too short. He jumped off his head. Swinging his hand, the guy said to him, "Open his mouth." A small seed flashed through the air. It flew into the beaver's mouth. Brown-haired man clenched his teeth tightly and began to mentally beg. The animal froze. Suddenly, it began to decrease in size. The protagonist clenched his fist victoriously. The beaver began to climb out of the water. Looking at the trees, he indignantly asked why they had become so big. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed it. The animal in his arms screamed loudly. Lloyd smiled madly, exclaiming that he caught it. While it was trying to break free, he asked it to calm down. The animal hit him in the face with its tail. Having broken free, it began to run away, and everyone began to catch it. Brown-haired man sent Hippo and Peepodong after him. Peepodong appeared in front of the beaver. He hit him in the face with his paw. The mouse wiped his bruised cheek. He sent his rival away in response. Then they began to fight. Hippo jumped on them from above. The animal jumped back, avoiding the blow. He ran into the thick of the forest. Suddenly the main character appeared in front of him, asking where he was going. Belle jumped off his shoulder. The snake buried its muzzle in the ground. Then it rose, shaking its head. Belle languidly opened its eyes. At that moment, even he, who appeared in this world for unknown reasons, a 500-year-old dormant legend, the Royal Storm, saw the light for the first time in his life. Beaver looked at her with an ecstatic look. The main character looked at the two animals. He narrowed his eyes suspiciously. A blush appeared on the beast's cheeks. Lloyd squatted down, asking if he was ready to talk to him now. Beaver hung his head. Adjusting his bangs, he said that this time he would give in, because he was a gentleman after all. The guy smiled slyly, thinking that now the capture of the legendary beast was complete. They moved to the palace. Beaver crossed his paws, asking what the man wanted from him. The brown-haired man waved his hand with a grin and said that everything was simple. Once in the morning, once in the evening he would need to shout at the lake. Looking at him with displeasure, the beast exclaimed that he knew nothing about negotiations, because everyone knows that you need to offer something in return before asking. The protagonist put his hand behind his head in confusion and muttered that he didn't have much to offer. A grin appeared on his face when he said that if he helped them, then they would all be happy here. Smiling madly, the protagonist leaned towards Belle and asked if she thought the same. The snake smiled happily. The beaver looked at her with a fascinated look. Lloyd turned white and raised his fist when he agreed. Stretching his lips into a sly smile, he mentally called him a stupid slave and noted that he could already be used. Looking at Belle, the guy thought that she had no feelings for him at all. Continuing to mock, he thought that he would bestow upon him the nickname Forever Lonely Royal Storm, and that the two of them would never be together. The smile on his face changed to a puzzled one when he realized that he had never dated anyone either. The brown-haired man approached the beaver. Taking him in his hand, he pressed his cheek against it, thinking that the two of them would be alone forever. Meanwhile, the beast wondered what was wrong with him. He pressed himself against him in response, trying to understand what this incomprehensible warm feeling was. Thus, Lloyd and the Royal Storm found a kindred spirit in each other. Looking at the beaver with admiration, the protagonist asked if he could call him Baibong. He replied that he could do whatever he wanted. A moment later, a man burst into the office. Lloyd asked the sergeant what was the matter and whether he had left with the orc tribe. The brown-haired man shouted with horror in his eyes that on the way there they met an orc who was walking towards them, and he was in a hurry to get reinforcements because their tribe was Acnopnal Megalania. The guy immediately frowned. At that moment, large lizards were destroying the orc tribe. Akuch with an angry face called on his comrades to attack. He jumped on the monster. He hit him on the head with his totem. The beast looked at him with its green eyes. The man shook himself. The lizard swung its tail. A moment later, it hit the orc. Because of Clar, he flew to the side. His comrades immediately ran up to him. The brunette frowned and ordered them not to retreat because they were strong orcs and would never give up. The main character jumped up and waved his hand, telling him to tell Commander Blank that they needed to gather warriors. The sergeant objected, saying that even if they left right now, they wouldn't make it in time. Holding the beaver in his hand, the brown-haired man exclaimed that he had a plan, and then urged the man on. Rushing forward, he replied that they needed to hurry because this was their chance. Xavier next to him asked what chance they were talking about now. A mad smile appeared on Lloyd's face as he said that they would stop this domino of monsters. Handing the seed to the beaver, he exclaimed that it was time for a counterattack. In the street, the people looked up in shock. Their mouths were wide open. Baibong, who had grown in size, jumped up. The guy, grabbing his fur, told him to go ahead because they must show themselves in all their glory and win Belle's heart. After these words, the beaver screamed with enthusiasm. He landed on the trees. Then he jumped again. Blank and his knights also held tightly to the beast's fur. The beast quickly cut through the air. After a while, the forests gave way to deserted terrain. Baibung pushed off the rock. Meanwhile, the megalania, opening its mouth, roared. The orcs rushed to attack the lizards. After a short time, the beaver appeared. He jumped right in front of the orcs. Akuch covered his face from the flow of sand. The beaver straightened his back in front of the megalanias. Brown-haired also rose to his feet and began to say this with his gaze and bury it deep in their hearts, pass it on to his monster friends, and if they move west, there will be no hunting. Wide opening his crazy eyes, she noted that this was because they are the hunters and they are the prey. The megalanias trembled with fear. Baibung swung his paw. Then he grabbed and hit several lizards. He waved his hand again. A moment later, he threw the monsters into the sky. They, with their mouths open, flew through the air. After they landed in the forest, a loud sound was heard. Beaver began to shrink in size. He turned around, seeing Belle behind him. The snake smiled happily and babbled. Baibung grabbed his reddened cheeks. Blank approached the protagonist and thanked them for calling them here, but he did not think they still needed them. Lloyd laughed and asked why he would invite such a precious force for such a thing. He said that they had another important task. Akuch approached them, holding his shoulder. The guy asked if he was okay. Orit looked down and said that they were no longer his allies. The brown-haired man looked at him with a puzzled look. Akuch spread his arms and exhaled loudly. He and his tribesmen folded their fists, exclaiming that he had saved them twice, so they, the Iron Sand tribe, swear allegiance to the Frontera family. With a smirk, the protagonist crossed his arms and noted that it was too early for them to thank him, and then asked if it was time to begin the next stage of the plan, saving the orc tribe. The man looked at him with a puzzled look. Warriors were walking through the fields with torches in their hands. It was said that not long ago, the Sultan of Isfahan, a neighboring kingdom to the east of the wasteland, set fire to the reed fields of his kingdom for strategic purposes. A swarm of locusts rose into the air. This was what gave birth to the beginning of the domino of monsters. Trolls were walking through the forest with weapons. It was said that some monsters were intelligent. Many of these monsters gathered in wild tribes. And now they witnessed how the top predators of the megalania scattered papyrus paper in different directions. The lizards flew over the heads of the trolls. It was said that rumors about this began to spread very quickly among the intelligent monsters. A huge black monster walked along the forest crowns. It was said that it was like the mountains in the west. Its size was so great that it could touch the sky. Its tail was filled with the wrath of the gods and could probably cause a hurricane. It had black round eyes, and its gaze was like a deep abyss. It had 2 large fangs with which it could calmly outlive any living thing in this world, and a red silhouette was visible on the forehead of the monster. The protagonist with red hair grinned angrily. It was noted that these were the eyes of the devil that controlled the monster. Baibung turned around, puzzled. Royal Palace of Isfahan. The Sultan sat on his throne while he was being greeted. A man sat near him, telling him that the tribe, the steel sand that had long threatened their lands, has left his village, and he went deep into the forest of the kingdom of Mangintano. The old man stroked his beard, saying that this was a victory for them, and then asked how the kingdom of Mangintano dealt with them. Bowing his head, the man replied that it was without any disagreement, and they simply crossed the borders calmly. The man replied that he would like to see the hated Mangintano drown in chaos. The Sultan, leaning on his arm, said that if this was all, then he was free. The warrior, looking at the floor in fear, muttered that this was all, but something else had happened. The old man cast an interested look at him. Imagining many monsters, he spoke of the monsters returning and attacking their borders. The Sultan frowned and asked again. The man, looking at the floor tensely, noted that they were doing everything in their power to stop the monsters. However, the monsters were rushing at great speed, frightened by the protagonist. The knight said that they seemed to be completely mad with fear of something, but they would not be broken so easily. The Sultan stood up and waved his hand, ordering them to gather forces and use their firepower to instill more fear into the monsters. The man accepted his order. The old man sank down on the pillows, thinking that the tactics of the monster wave had turned against them. He pursed his lips, with an angry face, wondering if this was part of Mangintano's plan. He thought that it was not so, because the waves of monsters were huge, and their return to them was impossible unless a real beast appeared in the west. The protagonist held out the papers with a smile, asking him to sign here. Opposite him on the sofa sat 2 men, asking what kind of paper was this. Lloyd replied that everything was written there. Smiling sweetly, he noted the full payment of the debt. Looking at the paper with the amount, he said that it was a check that he wrote out for them, taking into account the interest. The man immediately grabbed it, and the guy asked what they would say. Looking at them with a gloomy look, he told them to sign quickly and get out of here. Declaring in the office, Arcus crossed paths with the guests. He and his wife approached their son. Looking at him with puzzled eyes, the brown-haired man asked if it was true that he paid their debt. The protagonist showed him a check for full payment and asked if it was worth hanging in a frame. A moment later, his father hugged him. Starting to cry, he noted in a trembling voice that he worked so hard to pay for his father's mistakes, and then began to apologize for making him suffer so much all this time. Lloyd stood there, puzzled, as he put together the man's words about not knowing if he was worthy of being a father. He lowered his empty gaze. The boy placed his hands on his father's shoulders. Looking sadly, he asked if he loved him. Crying bitterly, Arcus asked him why he asked such questions and noted that of course he loved his son. The tent fell silent. Smiling softly, he asked if he needed any other reasons to be a father in that case. The system noted his new achievement called Debt Bondage Release Number 1, which covered the entire Cremona region, and the accrued CP was 2. The effect of the title is the highest level of creditworthiness, the lowest interest rate, and the most favorable conditions. The bright sun sparkled in the sky. The protagonist walked along the illuminated corridor. Xavier approached him and said that the relocation of the Steel Sand tribe to the eastern mountains was complete. Lloyd praised him. He started to walk past him when the knight said that the white archers were helping with the final preparations, and Akuch was overjoyed that he would have more food to help keep his muscles in better shape. The boy noted that he understood and then told him to go and rest for a while. The blonde Martian looked at him. As he continued walking down the hallway, the brown-haired man mentally noted that the Steel Sand tribe had been transported to the forests of the eastern mountains, and even if the monsters were to return, it would take some time, and if that happened, he would acknowledge Baibong and their estate would be saved. He pursed his lips, thinking that now that he had paid off the entire debt, he had nothing to worry about anymore. He found it strange that he was not having fun after paying off the debt. The protagonist lowered his head, wondering if he was having fun or just messing around. The blue sky was visible outside his window. Lloyd was lying on his bed. He remembered his crying father. The boy looked up with empty eyes. Then he remembered his real father, who, crying, told him that he was ignorant because life does not teach him anything, and he made his son suffer. The man began to ask for forgiveness. The brown-haired man covered his eyes with his hand. Clutching the bedclothes with his hand, he, trembling, told his father that he had succeeded. Starting to cry, he asked for forgiveness for not being able to help. The protagonist clenched his teeth tightly. Then he pressed his face into the pillow. Xavier stood at his door, hearing sobs. Lloyd cried bitterly. The knight closed his eyes. Starting to walk along the corridors, he mentally told him to cry as much as his heart desires, because he has many reasons for that. A couple of days later, the townspeople smiled joyfully, wishing long life to the young master. They raised their hands of faith, asking him to look at them. Lloyd walked with his knight. Looking at the townspeople with displeasure, he noted that they were too noisy and asked them to stop. The guy glanced at the fair-haired man when he asked him to try to enjoy this moment at least a little. He asked him why. Looking at the happy locals, Xavier said that all these people could not smile so widely if it were not for him. The brown-haired man turned away from him and asked, didn't he say earlier that it should eat and live for a very long time? Bayern ran out to him, raising the alarm. He asked him what happened. The man, breathing heavily, said that a very large number of people were moving from the south. The main character, looking at him with puzzled eyes, asked if they were enemies. Bayern replied that he was not quite sure, but from what the soldiers said, they looked like refugees. Many people in rags were walking along the path. There was a blue sky above the city. Lloyd went out to the refugees, and the man asked if he was the owner of these lands. He answered with narrowed eyes that he was his son, and then asked who they were. The man bowed his head and said that they came from the south, and that they were Baron Sortino's people. He said that his name was Nicholas, and he was the head of the village of Answorthy. The guy listened with gloomy eyes to his words that his father was the village elder, and he ordered them to leave. The brown-haired man turned his attention to the old people and the woman with the child. He also saw that a board was tied to Nicholas's leg instead of a shoe. The man said that his father defended their lands together with the Baron and died doing his duty. At that moment, the girl was holding onto the trembling old woman. The main character put out his hands, interrupting the story. He raised an eyebrow in confusion, asking what happened there and whether the reason could be an attack by monsters. Nicholas, looking at him, said that he was 2 meters tall and came in a real crowd. There were several hundred of them, and they flew in like a swarm of bees. Face touched his chin when Xavier said that it was a wave of a domino monster, which meant that the scale of the disaster was greater than they thought. Imagining a map of the area, the guy thought that it could be said that all the regions connected to the wasteland were heavily damaged. Then imagining 4 animals with Xavier with a sword, the guy thought that he had everything. Touching his chin, he still imagined the map, wondering where the refugees would go if there was a sea further north. To the south there was another country, to the west there was an island called Cremo, but it was too far. Brown-haired realized that the last refuge of the refugees was Frontera and Lacona, and it was more likely that they would all move to the center. Looking away with a tense look, he wondered how many people they should expect. The refugees fell to their knees and began to beg for help and to give at least one piece of bread to feed their children. Xavier looked at the gentleman and said that most likely more refugees would come to them, and then asked if he had a plan on how to deal with them. The protagonist smiled madly, saying that it was very exciting. The blonde man perked up when he saw it. Lloyd looked at him with a wide smile when he asked him what he was thinking in such a situation. He rustled his fingers, telling the knight to just think about how many people were coming to their lands and how much tax they could take from him. The guy widened his eyes and loudly asked if he was really going to take money from these people now. The protagonist put his hand in his pocket and told Bayern to immediately retrain the construction unit into a young cook to prepare food. The refugees bowed their heads again, thanking him. Lloyd called the knight to follow him. The man waved his hand towards Xavier and told him not to be so emotional, but he replied that it was too much. Bayern smiled happily, saying that in his opinion, the gentleman is a very kind person and understands others well, and in general, they know his true intentions, so it is too early to start getting angry, and they need to watch him first. The fair-haired man bashfully looked away. After a while, a loud scream was heard in the castle. Arcus sat across from his son, saying that he knew it was a good thing, but he didn't have the resources to take them all in. The brown-haired man asked if he was willing to take them in. The man answered in the affirmative, saying that they couldn't just leave these poor souls in trouble. He gritted his teeth, saying that however, their food would only last for a couple of days, and then there would be nothing to feed them with. The protagonist looked at him, puzzled, and asked what he was talking about. He smirked and said that they just had a bunch of food for the refugees. After a while, he looked at the locust meat. Standing in the warehouse with his parents, Lloyd noted that they were collecting them to use for compost, and that's why they were storing them here. His father looked at him with a worried look and said that feeding the refugees these insects was a bet. He was shocked when his wife suddenly tried the meat. She looked at her husband and said that it tasted like shrimp, and since the orcs also ate it, she didn't see a problem. The woman rested her cheek on her hand, saying that there was a slight unpleasant smell, but they would try to do something about it. The guy smiled widely when she asked if he could lead the cooking unit. He answered in the affirmative, noting that this was why he had called her. After a while, a tent camp was set up. When the brown-haired man began to inspect it, Blank exclaimed that the first temporary tent had been erected, and he asked him to prepare even more materials as quickly as possible. The man on the observation tower waved a flag and said that about 100 more refugees were coming here. The protagonist grinned, saying that it was much faster than he thought. A large peapodong appeared next to him when he told him that everything needed to be done as soon as possible, because if they hesitated, the people would simply freeze. The mouse stuck his paws in the ground. Then he began to dig a hole. Bayern, holding a document in his hands, shouted loudly that they were recruiting a team to build heating systems. After Belle ordered, she spewed out water. The man waved a flag, telling about the arrival of people from the south and north. Marbella, standing in front of the women, exclaimed that now was the time to start turning insects into nutritious food. The women looked at her with puzzled eyes, saying that this was too much. The blonde closed her eyes. She showed them a book, saying that many years ago, a legendary cookbook was born, and it was written by a girl who was a cook for a dragon. She noted that its secrets were revealed in the book How I Became the Dragon King's Chef, and the book itself was found among the things of the black magician who was defeated by Lloyd. The women opened their mouths in surprise, exclaiming that this was a book of legendary recipes. Someone noted that thanks to this book, you can turn the most direct pain into heavenly. The system marked the end of the advertising integration. The protagonist looked down on the tent camp from above. He narrowed his eyes, thinking that there was still not enough space, and even if they filled the temporary settlements to the eastern mountains, there would still not be enough space. Lloyd scratched his head, thinking that for a while it would be enough, but in the long run. Suddenly he heard a loud cry. A woman was sitting by the tent with a child in her arms, who was crying and saying that he really wanted to go home. The mother told him that they no longer had a home, and they should be grateful that the people had given them shelter. The guy pursed his lips, hearing the child telling his dad to build them a new house. The woman apologized and said that someday they would definitely build it. The brown-haired man thought about home. He imagined his parents and thought that he remembered the first time he moved into their house, how he packed his things, and how happy his father and mother were. Remembering their faces, he thought about how they constantly repeated the word home and smiled, and these were smiles that he would never be able to see again. Next, he imagined small multi-story buildings, thinking that it was a small and shabby apartment on the outskirts, the very place that holds the happiest memories in his life. The woman herself was crying, hugging a child. The protagonist darkened, quietly telling him not to worry because very soon they will have a home. Starting to rise, he added that it was because he was here. Not far from him stood Xavier. Smiling, he sighed. The gentleman looked at him and noted that from now on, They will begin construction at a higher level than ever before. As he passed by, the blonde man asked if he had a plan for the refugees. The protagonist replied that of course he did. Lloyd smiled contentedly, saying that he was going to build an apartment complex. Apartments are a popular building style in Korea and the most effective solution to the problem that the estate currently faced. Imagining many multi-story buildings, the guy noted that in this space it is possible to build a huge complex of residential buildings, and this is a dense management due to the density of population. Then he imagined the design of the apartment itself, thinking about reducing the cost and time for construction. Then the brown-haired man imagined many people in the apartments, thinking that above, below and on the side everything is surrounded by walls, ideal for super maximum thermal insulation. He looked at the bay from above. With a sparkle in his eyes, the main character thought that the biggest thing was that they would be able to build an environment where refugees can be independent. Having designed holograms of multi-story buildings, he thought about the need to focus on their population and increase food power and establish a market. Then he fell to his knees, throwing up his hands, realizing that he could raise the tax. Smiling madly, the brown-haired man clenched his fists, thinking that after all this he could sit down and rest, provide a bath and money, mentally noting that the desire of every simple person is to make a fortune while not straining too much. He began to think that he would not have to manage the estate, and he could shift the duties to Bayern for a bonus and a raise. After the main character wondered what if he retire, and then decided that he would ask to raise a replacement for himself. The man suddenly grabbed his head, saying that he rarely felt unwell. After a while, Lloyd found himself with the others at the table, saying that he was risking a meeting about the construction of the Honey apartment complex, and then asked to pay a little attention to the information that he provided them. He began to point his fingers when Xavier said that he had objections regarding the name, which sounds much more narcissistic. The guy told him not to chatter off the point since they were at a meeting. The blonde said that he was not chatting because his words directly concerned the project. The brown-haired man exclaimed, telling him to get down to business because he was holding up the meeting. Looking at the gloomy Bayern, he asked how he was feeling. He replied that he had been having the same dream for several days, in which he worked for the devil until he grew old and died. The protagonist told him not to worry because such a thing would definitely not happen to him. He picked up the papers and offered to look at all the information provided. Showing a roundhouse, he explained that it was called Tori and it was a fortress-type residential complex that came from the eastern province of Fujian. Introducing it from the inside, Lloyd said that such buildings have the same style of construction with a simple bedroom and living room, and in the center there will be public spaces like a plane or a public toilet. He showed the next drawing, saying that he planned to build the same building, but in a square shape, because a square structure is erected much faster than a round one. Looking at all his comrades, Parquet said that he compared both buildings on several criteria, but did not take into account one huge advantage. He smirked, imagining the attack, and said that if they installed steel gates, the building would instantly turn into an impregnable fortress. Only Blank suddenly clapped his hands. Brown-haired also clapped and said that now is the time for questions. He began pointing his fingers when Xavier said that with their current financial situation, it was difficult to even get material for the refugee tents. The protagonist asked him if he was really suggesting to abandon them to their fate just because they were the ones bearing the financial burden. The fair-haired man replied that he did not mean that. Lloyd demanded only a positive or negative answer from him. He bowed his head when his father said that although he was worried about the finances, they should do something for these people. The boy responded by saying that he could only admire how brightly he looked into the future. He smiled and said that they needed to erect and prepare tents with a heating system and continue to provide food for the people. He noted that they would most likely have to give up all their money for the sake of the people. The brown-haired man mentally noted that they would have to raise as much money as possible to build them. The horses shuffled their hooves on the ground. The protagonist looked at the disgruntled Xavier and asked what was wrong with his face. He noted that he saw that he was offended, so much so that he did not even look him in the eyes. The blonde turned around with a tense look. Lloyd squinted in confusion. He turned away, saying that it was scary. Having brought his horse forward, he asked if they would succeed with this wild project or would they fail. He asked if they would be able to accommodate all the people, and then said that this was his project and he was in charge of it. Xavier looked at the back of the gentleman, who said that the one in charge should not hesitate and think, because only in this way can one earn absolute trust. Without turning his head, the guy said that the one who could let go of this bluff for a while was Xavier. The blonde's eyes widened. He looked down. Veins bulged on his face when he asked if it was true that this was some kind of emotional outlet. The brown-haired man smiled wickedly. A moment later, the knight hit him on the head, but only in his thoughts. They reached the Racona estate. The blonde was walking down the corridor. Two guys were walking towards him. The protagonist smiled widely and said that he was glad to meet him. Diego screamed in fear. Covering his head, he trembled when his face noted that they had not seen each other for a long time and asked what his scream meant. He asked how he was doing and if he was enjoying his expulsion. The blonde began to quietly call his father. The guy grabbed his hand, telling him not to be so afraid, because he was here to bring him back to the academy. Approaching, he, breathing steam, loudly said to quickly call his father. After a while, Viscount Racona was sitting in front of him, asking what does the increase in taxes mean. The brown-haired man leaned back on the couch, noting that he was talking about the tax on water. The man clenched his teeth, mentally cursing him, thinking that his son had been expelled from the academy, and now he wanted to raise taxes. His lips spread into a smile. He bowed his head and left. The Viscount went to the window, saying that he did not think he could understand because he was still so young. He showed the contract and said that according to the terms of this agreement, the price was fixed and he had no right to increase the price. Waving his hand, the chief took out a magnifying glass with his hand. Leaning it on the paper, he read a small paragraph of a footnote that the price stipulated in the contract could change depending on the mood of the supplier. The man grabbed him by the collar, shouting that this was a scam. Lloyd asked him to stop. He smirked, saying that they should stop this, after all, they were neighbors, and then noted that he was not forcing him to sign, and it would be better to call it an exchange from which he would benefit. The Viscount bared his teeth in irritation. The guy pointed his finger and said that firstly, 17 settlements were destroyed by monsters, and all the refugees started to flee here, but the Viscount drove them away. He looked at him with a gloomy look and suggested pretending that he didn't know anything about it, but Her Majesty would be very upset if he found out about it. The man, white with fear, wondered where the benefit was for him if this was blackmail. The brown-haired man clasped his hands and started talking about the second point, noting that he was saying this only in his own interests. He smiled sweetly and said that if he wrote a letter of recommendation, perhaps Diego would be able to return to the academy. Sweat began to flow down Racona's face. He began to gulp air greedily. Gritting his teeth tightly, the Viscount asked how much he would raise the tax. The protagonist ran his hand through his hair and asked why he was talking like that, because people might think that he was a criminal who came to be rude to him. However, he looked at the man with disdain, saying that in order not to embarrass him, he would raise it just a little, enough so that their friendship would continue. The Viscount, white with horror, mentally asked him to just tell him the amount.